Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and in this video we're breaking down the Alien franchise. After our big deep dive into the original quadrilogy, I thought we'd take a look at the prequels and spin-offs. Throughout this video, we're going to be going through both Prometheus and Covenant, along with Alien Romulus. That's the film I want to start off on first, but I'll leave time codes below if you want to skip to a certain film. With that out of the way though, thank you for clicking this. Now let's get into Alien. Throughout this video, we'll be going through the Easter eggs, making of trivia, and behind the scenes details. I'm a massive fan of the franchise, and it felt so good returning to the Alien universe. However, the franchise has been in a funny place over the last couple of years, with there being a constant stop and start of projects. We were initially supposed to get an Alien sequel, which was going to be directed by Neil Blomkamp. This would actually work as a direct sequel to Aliens and remove Alien 3 and Resurrection from the timeline. It's something similar to what we saw with Dark Fate, where they'd build this up and scrap the lesser received sequels. However, due to Ridley Scott working on Prometheus and Covenant, he ended up blocking that film with the studio. You might notice that his name's attached to this as producer, which likely helped move it along. What was a big thing that got this off the ground though was Disney's acquisition of Fox. Not only were they looking at their popular franchises, but they also needed content for their streaming service. Prey of course got pushed into production, and Romulus was going to follow a similar path. Initially intended to be a film for Hulu, I think Prey's success showed the studio what they had. Many people, myself included, we screamed for the movie to be released in cinemas, and I guess in space, people can hear you scream. Fede Alvarez was given the job of writing and directing it after he pitched his own unconnected story. However, there are clear nods to pretty much all of the original films. I've done a big 2.5 hour breakdown on those movies if you want to check that out, but obviously we'll go through the connections as we work through this film. Tonally, I think it manages to capture them all, with us getting the tension of Alien, action of Aliens, and then some of the bolder choices they made in the latter two. You also have the black goo from Ridley Scott's prequels, and it does a great job of bringing everything together. Now, the title Romulus was chosen for a number of reasons, with it being linked to Romulus and Remus. As we learn, the Renaissance split into two parts, with each of these carrying the name. Renaissance is also used because they're trying to revitalize the franchise. Now, in doing my research, I found that the two parts were designed to reflect the tone, with them being symbolic of what style they were going for. Everything that happens on Remus is supposed to be more in line with Alien, whereas when the characters journey onto Romulus, we then switch to the action-heavy style of Aliens. This even comes down to the technology, with the more advanced weapons and computers appearing in the latter half. We also see a painting that depicts the aftermath of a plague and can catch a child breastfeeding from their dead mother. This actually foreshadows the ending, in which the offspring's found suckling on Kay. In both cases, the mother ends up dead, with a painting depicting the victims of a plague. This plays into the themes of how humans are often destroyed by diseases, with this station attempting to wipe that out. Romulus and Remus also suckled on their breasts, so it all kind of ties it together. Now, these names come from classic myths and legends, and names like this have been used throughout the franchise. Ripley's shuttle and Narcissus comes from the Greek myth of a man who fell in love with his own reflection before being turned into a flower. Alien Resurrection's ship had the name Auriga after the Greek hero, and the Prometheus was named after the titan who gave fire to the mortals. Anyway, the first movie in the franchise is the main basis of everything, which we see even down to the title. That is Alien Romulus, not Aliens Romulus, and the style of that film can be seen across the board. Akin to that film, we have a similar plot structure, with a group of people unwittingly awakening a sleeping facehugger on board a strange vessel. This then attaches to a crew member's face, and then after the xenomorph bursts out, all hell's unleashed. Now, the victim of that facehugger is Navarro, and you might have noticed it's her head on the poster. So this gives away exactly who dies first, and I love when films kind of spoil things like this subtly in the marketing. Now, we begin with a 20th century studio logo, with a note of the fanfare descending into a drone. This was first introduced on Alien 3, where it was also used to kickstart the movie. Beyond that though, the screen changes to green and gets a VHS effect to it. This green colouring was used heavily on the cover of Alien Isolation, and the inspiration of that game's laced throughout the movie. Fede apparently played it a lot when making Don't Breathe, and it helped the director to see how to build tension. According to IMDb trivia, this made him realize how terrifying the xenomorph could be if you took things back to that original tone. Throughout the film, you can also spot several emergency phone points which are used in the game to save your progress. In the game, they were strategically placed, so they either appeared right after something bad had happened or just right before. In the movie, they appear just before something bad's about to go down, and it's such a cool way to hint something big's coming. Alvarez also somewhat recreates the look of the box, with Rain later donning a spacesuit and astronaut helmet. This of course riffs off what Ripley wore at the end of Alien, but I definitely think the ties there to Isolation 2. That's 2 spelled T-O-O, but we are also getting an Isolation 2. They've just announced it. It's one of my favourite games of all time, so I'm absolutely over the moon they're making another one. I'll never forgive IGN for telling me it was a bad game and it put me off buying it for years and years. But we're back. Now in the game you use flares as a distraction, which is also how they're employed in the movie. Beyond that we also get the stun stick, which was used as a weapon to fight against the working Joes. Bjorn later on grabs one and he talks about how he could fry a synthetic. Now we begin in space with a backdrop of the stars and titles. This font is a perfect recreation of the one used in Alien, which was also used to kickstart that film. There we watch the Nostromo coming in, and here we silently watch the Echo probe coming towards us. I love how this plays off there being no sound in space, and it just ties in nicely with the original movie's tagline. Just like that, we see a computer flicking on, which also reflects onto another surface. In Alien it was onto a helmet, whereas here it's onto some machine. No idea what that is. Now as the probe starts up, we learn this is a salvage team heading towards a Nostromo. This is akin to the opening of Aliens, where Ripley's shuttle was picked up by a salvage crew. On board the vessel, we can even catch them wearing the big protective suits that the crew were donning when they approached Ripley's stasis pod. Now this film confirms a theory that fans of the franchise have had for a long time. We learn that Ripley was secretly picked up by the corporation, and you can see her shuttle at 2 points in the film. During the scene in which Kay's locked in with the xenomorph, we can catch it as Andy approaches the door. This was confirmed by the creative team, who said they added it to this moment. Now as we know, the ship ends up crashing, so you may be wondering how she escaped. However, just before the ship hits the asteroid belt, we can spot it being ejected into space. When asked about this, weather effects supervisor Daniel Macaron said the following: "Anytime we're asked to put an Easter egg, it's always really fun. The hard part is not making something too obvious and not taking away from the story. So a lot of times it's like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if we did this? It's like, yeah, but you're going to lose the shot. I don't want to put something in there that the audience is going to go, oh, look, there it is. And then people start guessing about that. So with Ripley's ship, if you put it in really small, it's fine. So that's why it's a bit difficult to notice, and it looks like they found her along with Big Chap. This is why Rocco later knows the Nostromo only had a sole survivor. If they hadn't picked it up, they'd have just thought the Nostromo self-destructed and would only be aware Ripley lived due to finding her log. This movie also confirms that Ash was aware of the mission and that Weyland-Yutani was secretly after the xenomorph. So that's another fan theory confirmed, with theory time confirmed. Anyway, back to the computer starting up, and this is white text on a red background. This program was probably carried across all ships, as we had the same white on red when the Nostromo started up. We then see the program is Mother 9001. In the first film, the computer was of course Mother, with this being a little nod to that. Beyond that though, 9001 was supposed to be a nod to HAL 9000. That was the computer from 2001: A Space Odyssey, with Scott admitting he took a lot of inspiration from the film. Later on at the 2420 mark, we can see it's Mother 9000, so this extra number up is because this is on the probe. Now as it comes across the rock, we can see the Weyland-Yutani logo. This is dotted throughout the film, with the company being involved in every aspect of life. I'll talk about the more subtle references later on, but the corporation has control of everything. This is why Rain's desperate to escape them, as they've basically turned humanity into slaves. Now we watch as they cut into the rock, which Big Chap has secreted itself into. At this point we get a top-down view which looks akin to the logo for Alien 3. I also felt like this was building off the poster for Covenant, and I love how you can make something out in the rock. Now we then get the logo with the text being similar to the original Alien. However, whereas that's slowly formed on screen, we see as this is fully formed and then works backwards. To me, this highlights we're going back in time and sort of having a prequel-sequel segue in between the first two films. When it comes to the timeline, we know that Alien took place in 2122. Aliens takes place place in 2179, with this movie happening in 2142. This is something we see on screen during the opening, with it also saying it's a Zeta Reticuli system. This is a real life system with it sharing a similar solar system to ours. So Weyland Yutani are starting to terraform planets, which we see them heavily involved in when we finally get to Aliens. Now in the director's cut of that, we had a scene where we saw life at a colony and you could catch kids playing in the corridors. This was actually the moment that inspired this movie, and Alvarez said the following when talking about it. There's a moment where you see a bunch of kids running around the corridors of this colony, and I thought, wow, what would it be like for those kids to grow up in a colony that still needs another 50 years to terraform? So I remember thinking, if I ever tell a story in that world, I would definitely be interested in those kids when they reach their early 20s. Now I know the movie got a lot of criticism when the trailer dropped because the actors were the youngest in the franchise. However, I remember being that age, and yeah, I can totally believe they do this stupid risky plan without fully thinking about what could potentially happen. Now they're all driven by this idea of escaping to Yavaga. Though the dream makes it seem like a paradise, Fede has hinted it might not be the case. Though the word translates to heaven, it's possible that this isn't the promised land. When discussing sequel ideas, Alvarez talked about this idea of fantasy and how reality often doesn't live up to it. He started brainstorming about what could happen there and hinted at a sequel going down on the planet. Design wise, it looks a lot like the alternate ending of Alien Resurrection, where the Ripley clone managed to make it back to Earth. We also have it being like a sunset, with them possibly taking inspiration from A New Hope. There we had Luke looking out over twin suns, also desperate to escape from his life. Either way, it's a picturesque location, but we cut from the dream into the cold, harsh reality. Waking up to the sound of machinery, we catch Rain cramped in her very small bed. Made to sleep alongside the other workers, she hasn't really got any privacy or place to call her own. These beds also popped up throughout Alien in Isolation, and we also have some details carried over from them. These include the Polaroid photos, which we see stuck up above her head. Cutting to Rain on a window that showcases the planet, we see one of the giant reactors that was where the hive was located at in Aliens. You might also notice that it's constantly raining, and we learn there's been 0 days of sunlight on the planet. Thus, when they travel into space, you can see why Rain's first sight of the sun means so much to her. However, this is then eclipsed by the station, which symbolically shows that standing in the way. This idea of nothing but rain was taken from Blade Runner, with there constantly being a downpour in LA. Scott put this in place because he wanted the location to feel like it was always beating down on you, and I feel like Alvarez has done the same thing here. Cutting to her getting lunch, we can also see a dipping bird at the table. This prop's ripped right out of the first film, where we could catch it on board the Nostromo. Now it's at this point we meet Andy, which is of course short for Android. The character's full designation is the ND-255, and I feel like they got the name Andy from several things involving him. ND 2255, you see what I'm saying? Now these androids could also link in with Blade Runner, which Ridley Scott was of course a director of. Those films featured the Weyland core, which fans have linked with Weyland Yutani. Both also center heavily around androids, and we could get a little nod to it in the film. At 12:22 we see an origami animal, with it being a possible link to the unicorn. In Blade Runner we also discover the androids were heavily used in space travel, and they were a backbone workforce enslaved to build colonies. This ties in with what we learn about Andy, and we discover through Rook that he was used to do the same thing. I don't know if the colonization aspect of it ties in with the actor's race or not, but I definitely think that there's some subtext you can draw there. It's clear Andy was very much disposable though, and he was thrown away after he served his purpose. Alvarez has been pretty open about his past and has talked about their usage throughout the franchise. These ND-255s were used as overseers that would supervise the workforce at terraforming planets. However, they became old and obsolete, and eventually they were all decommissioned. It's likely that he was someone who helped terraform this planet, and it's through this that Rain's dad found him. Taking him home and fixing the droid, he then became part of the family. Now in doing this, he also created a carer for his daughter. Both he and her mother fell sick with Lyme disease, and knowing they were going to die, her father took solace in the fact that Andy would at least look after her. However, Fede touched upon how Andy's now became somewhat of a burden, as she now helps him more than he helps her. Because of this, you can see why she wants to leave him behind, but also why she feels guilt over it. This is the last tie to her family, and thus in leaving him, she'd somewhat be leaving them. Now though we don't get their full names, the ID screen shows they're deceased. This is alongside a picture of Rain, which is akin to the crew photos from the first film. It also details her first name's Marie, with Rain being a middle name. Either way, due to being old and outdated, he has his little glitches and hiccups. Andy's finger twitches throughout the film, which could be a little nod to this line.
Well, that explains it, and the U2s always were a bit twitchy.
Now when he sits down, there's some clues he's an android before we get the reveal. Rain grabs the food off his tray and they talk about how it's just a waste of food. We can also see that this is cornbread, which is what the Marines had in the aliens mess hall. Rain drinks from the cup whilst there's a bottle of milk there, and I'm guessing that this belongs to Andy. There's way too much milk for that little cup of coffee. Yeah, your coffee to milk ratio way off there, love. So because of this, I think it's the milk-like substance that we often see oozing from androids' wounds. This is across all of the androids in the franchise, and we talked about it in our Alien Breakdown. When Ripley came across Ash working in the lab, we could see the character drinking milk. So I did wonder if that was to replenish the fluid, and it could explain why this bottle's here. The cup that Rain uses is also similar to the one in the breakfast scene of Alien, and I love how they've brought across all these little things. Anyway, Rain and Andy head out into one of the main streets of Jackson, which is one of our many Last of Us Easter eggs. Jackson's the main colony in the story where Ellie and Joel end up living at. Fede's been open about the inspiration and has said Dina's pregnancy was what inspired Kay's. And what's a pretty crazy coincidence, Isabella Merced's now playing the character in the second season. I'm sure you guys will also have seen pictures of Kaylee Spaney up next to Ellie. The actor looks pretty much identical, and they definitely based a lot of her look here on the game. I feel like this carries across to Navarro as well, who seems like she might be based on Lev. This is mainly shown in the shaved head, which could also give us another little Easter egg. Alien 3 had Ripley with a shaved head, and this could be a little visual nod to the character. Going along the street, we also see a sign that says bar, which is identical to the one that was used at Hadley's Hope. On the streets, there's people running gambling scams and red light areas for workers as well. It just gives it this nefarious feeling and like it's a shady part of the planet. However, everywhere is likely like that, with people needing a place to mentally escape to. Though Rain's worked enough to leave, we see how the quota's adjusted. It highlights the control the corporation have on their lives and how they'll never truly allow them to be free. The clerk says this is due to a shortage of workers and that she's going to be transferred to the mines. My guess is that they died due to diseases, which is what the black goo will hopefully prevent. However, these places are death traps, and we discover that Bjorn's mother died in one. Several people were killed in an instant, and it's possible that this is a regular occurrence. Now we see as Andy's been beaten in the street, and this shows the hierarchy in society. Andy's not considered a person, and a lot of the characters look down on him. This is mainly seen in Bjorn, with an android having a hand in his mother's death. It's basically like that tram and lever meme where they choose to sacrifice someone in order to save others. However, it still hurts, and we see this logic later on the ship. Andy could have let Kay out, but in doing so, she'd also let through the xenomorph. It kind of shows a detachment from humanity, which in turn has made humanity detached from them. Humans obviously see things in an emotional way, and thus it was always going to be difficult to be attached to androids. I'm going to beat up you, Optimus, if you don't pour my drink fast enough, you piece of shit. Because of this, Bjorn constantly calls him a bitch, which could explain why he later on says this at the end.
Get away from her, you bitch.
Now, one of the more subtle things comes with Navarro, who does showcase her prejudice at one point. Just before taking off, she says a prayer in Mandarin, which remains unsubtitled in the movie. This translates to please protect the 5 of us, yet there's 6 on the ship. However, with one of these being Andy, it highlights she doesn't view him as a person. Now, Rain's able to fix Andy through a key that she keeps on a necklace. This highlights how he's close to her heart, and necklaces are used symbolically in the movie. Throughout it, you might also notice K's, with this being a miraculous metal. Typically, these have an image of the Virgin Mary, which is also the case here. Mary gave birth to Jesus through immaculate conception, and we never learn who the baby's father is. This is then born at the end of the movie with it being, let's say, a bit more than human. Now, the baby's mutated through using the black goo, which came from the engineers in Prometheus. As we learn, they created humanity, so they're very much a god to us mortals. Thus, the goo creating this baby could be the twisted version of the xenomorph Christ story. This tie to the engineers can also be seen in the offspring's face, which was deliberately designed to look exactly like them. So if you're reaching, which we are, then this offspring's somewhat the son of God, as it comes from the engineers who created us. Whew. Now the creative team, they've cleared up who the daddy is, and we know it's actually Bjorn. In the movie, this is Kay's cousin, so it kinda explains why the baby looks like that. Hey, have it that! Anyway, we see as Rain watches Tyler on her watch, but it's a bit stuttery. This obviously highlights the technology, but you might wonder how it fits in with the tech in the world. world. We've already seen how slick everything was in Prometheus, but Alvarez has explained this as being part of the class system. He said the rich elite are basically living with this Apple type tech, whereas the poor are having to deal with the Atari stuff. Anyway, Rain and Andy meet up with a gang and we learn that Tyler and Kay's dad's dead. Yay! This further pushes them to want to get off the planet though, and they talk about the ship flying above in space. Now here we can see Andy playing a video game that looks like something that's part of a Spectrum or a Commodore. This adds into the 8-bit feel of the movie, and the game itself could be a little nod to Aliens. Our editor Matt pointed out it looks like a colonial marine that's fighting against facehugger type creatures. We also properly meet Bjorn here with him wearing a headband similar to Vasquez. You might also notice Rain's wearing a Whale and Yutani shirt, and I like how it kind of plays into her character here. She's constantly trying to shut down the idea of leaving because she worries if they're caught then they'll never be allowed to go. She sort of represents the mental prison the corporation's got people confined to and how they won't try and escape in case it pisses off their masters. So it's a nice way to have the dissenting voice in the group at this point also wearing a symbol of the corporation. What she really wants to do though is get a chestburster t-shirt, which can be found in the merch store below. We designed these for our Alien series and I've had nothing but love from everyone who's bought one. You'll bloody love it as well, and if you want to support the channel, that's the best way to do it. Now we also learn that the reason they need Rain is because Andy can't bypass security. After Tyler gives her a wake-up call about how the company will never let them leave, we see the workers going to the mines. We then get focus on the canary in a cage, which I think carries a lot of symbolism. When mining, canaries were used to detect carbon monoxide as they'd be more sensitive to gas. This would then act as an early warning system and make the miners alert to the danger. Here, I feel like it's showing Rain stuck in a cage, and just like the canary, she'll be used in the mines. Which is subtext, kids. It's called subtext. Now, you might wonder why they're using canaries when miners stopped using them during the 1900s. I kinda took it as the corporation saving pennies wherever they could and doing this instead of paying for equipment. They just think lives are disposable, so it kinda plays into the whole themes of the film. Tyler here also reminds me a lot of Burke in Aliens. We watched as he went to recruit Ripley and told her she'd just be used as a consultant. Burke promised her she wouldn't have to leave the land now, with Tyler here saying Rain won't have to leave the ship. We then watch as the group take off and get Bjorn putting his head to Navarro's. This was explained more in interviews for the movie, and it turns out she's the character's adopted sister. Her parents apparently died as well, and she was then taken in by Bjorn's family. So we have what's basically 3 sets of siblings, which ties in with the themes of the film. There's Rain and Andy, Tyler and Kay, and lastly Bjorn and Navarro. Romulus and Remus were siblings as well, and it's a repeated motif in the movie. As they're taking off, Bjorn lights up a cigarette which he sparks with a massive lighter. Kinda reminded me of the flamethrower from Alien and how it looks in the end when Ripley moves through the corridors, but that's a reach. Anyway, the group is sent into space, which is shaky, filled with turbulence. It's sort of a reverse of the landing on LV-426, which scientists applauded at the time. Just 2 years earlier, New Hope had shown ships landing and taking off of planets, with it basically being like parking a car. Scott wanted to show how difficult it would be, which is why it was like that in the first movie. I feel like that's also the case here, and we see as the sun pretty much blinds them. That is, everyone except for Navarro, who we catch at the front rocking aviators. Really nice little nod to Aliens, as the dropship pilot there also wore them as well. I always thought that was just to look cool, but this sun moment explains why a pilot would wear them. Now from here we see as they mount up to board the ship and get a little audible callback. This elevator moving down the ladder sound reminded me a lot of this bit from Alien. We also see as Andy stops and touches a hook, which is the same one Rain later uses at the end to keep tethered to the ship. They also bring out the motion trackers that the Marines later used in Aliens. Attaching to the vessel, we get further nods to the vent scene as we see the circular gateways closing like how they did when Dallas was blocking off the area. This isn't really a place humans should be in, which we see as the ships attach. You might notice there's a sign that says synthetics only, and inside we see how cramped this is. The trio have to crawl along akin to Bishop moving through the pipeline during Aliens. When it comes to the music, we can also hear Entry of the Gods into Valhalla. This was featured in Alien Covenant, so it loosely ties the station to that movie. Black Goo! Valhalla in Norse mythology is the Hall of the Slain, with it being where those who died in glorious battle are taken to in their death. So its usage here could be signifying the fact the group are about to join the scientists that died. Inside they also pass a Whale and Yutani sign with a tagline building better worlds. This sign could be seen in Hadley's Hope, and it's a neat little visual callback. Now it's here yeah, they also introduced the gravity systems, which become a problem later on. These moments remind me a lot of Dead Space, which was heavily influenced by the franchise. In it, they've got several zero-G sections, so it's kind of coming full circle when they use it in this movie. As the gravity turns on, we also get a shot of Tyler's trainers. We know from the behind the scenes stuff that the entire crew were fitted with Reebok ones. Rain's especially are very similar to what Ripley wore in Aliens, with these being called Reebok Stompers. These were put on sale for the movie, but good luck affording them, mate, because the bidding alone starts off at about 250 quid. Either way, we watch as Andy sticks his finger into a hole to start the system up. That first film's full of sexual innuendo and penetration, with that facehugger tentacle being like, well, you can tell when it comes out the throat later. Ash also shoved a rolled up magazine in Ripley's mouth, and the head of the alien looks a lot like a dick. Matron. This was most notably seen in Geiger's drawings, where you can see a lot of sexual influence. So it makes sense that Alvarez would bring it across and have Andy's finger going into a hole. Bjorn also jokes that it's his first time, so yeah, lots of sexual innuendo there. Now they discover the cryopods, but unfortunately there's not enough fuel. Thus they go looking for the cryo bay, with Tyler doing military hand signals. Bjorn makes fun of him, but it could be a little nod to the Marines from Aliens. When it comes to the gun scene, Tyler knows what he's talking about, and he says that he studied things in magazines and video games. So him bringing this across, yeah, it makes sense, and I also feel like we get a reference to these soldiers once we hit the shuttle. There on the back of Navarro's chair, we can see the name Harrison, with this potentially being a nod to Andrew Harrison. He was in Aliens vs Predator 2, so it's kind of tying all these video game references together. Now it's here that Bjorn reveals that Andy's not coming to the planet, and he says,
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
This is a callback to Aliens, where Bishop said this.
I prefer the term artificial person myself.
I love the way Andy acts through it, and yeah, breaks my heart, mate. Reminds me of when my Tamagotchi battery ran out, but I'm still gonna kick the crap out of Optimus, you piece of shit. Now as they walk along, we also see a wet floor sign. I hope I haven't inadvertently just caused the machine uprising. Terminator's gonna happen. Moving on though, yeah, something similar to that was used in Alien Isolation, and normally when there was a body or blood on the floor. Making it to the lab, they see severed digits and can also catch Rook on the floor. As we see, he has the likeness of Ian Holm, who originally played Ash in the first film. Now, I was one of the people who thought it was distasteful at the time, but after doing my research, I think they handled it respectfully. Whether that comes across in the CGI presentation is a bit debatable, but yeah, if you thought it was disrespectful as well, then this might change your mind a bit. Fede ended up contacting Holmes' widow, who was the one that eventually signed off. I think being his wife makes things a bit more respectful, and it's not what you normally get where it's just the estate. With stuff like that, I always imagine some great-grandkid or lawyer who didn't even know the guy, but they're happy to take the money from the studio. Looking at you, George Reeves in The Flash, because he didn't have any kids or relatives who might have signed off on it. Superman was also the role that the actor said ruined his life, so yeah, looking at stuff like that, you know, it might be crossing the line. Either way, it was Ridley Scott who came up with the idea, with him saying Ash needed to make a comeback. He'd remained friends with Holm throughout the years and didn't think there'd be an issue with his usage. So Fede contacted his widow, who talked about Ian and his final years. She said that he'd felt somewhat forgotten about by Hollywood and that they'd sort of cast him to the side. He said he'd always loved Alien and wished there was a way he could return. Holm was initially asked to provide a voice for Alien Isolation, but he had to decline due to suffering from ill health. His rep said he would have loved to have done it, and his widow confirmed he'd have starred in Romulus if he could. Rook in the film is also heavily damaged, with this being a further nod to Aliens. Bishop there was ripped apart at the end of the movie, and Ripley talked to a damaged cyborg in the follow-up. The name Rook is also due to it being a chess piece, with Bishop being one as well. And though they could have potentially got Henriksen to star in the movie, Holmes' likeness was chosen for a reason. Scott said that models who look like this were for more secretive missions with the company. They pulled off the effect through using a puppet that was then enhanced with CGI. Daniel Betts was then brought in to do the voice, with AI then being applied to make it sound closer. AI is obviously a hot topic right now, but Fede said they at least had a voice actor to do it first, so it's not like they were taking away a job. Fede was obviously aware of the backlash, and he said, "We did it all with a lot of respect and always with the authorization of his family, his children and his widow, who said we would love to see his likeness again." So yeah, that's mainly why I changed my mind, but let me know your thoughts below if you haven't changed yours, or if you liked it in the first place. Anyway, they get to the fuel, but in removing it, the facehuggers start to hatch. This was the thing keeping them in stasis, and thus the ship quarantines the room. Rushing on board and taking Rook's chip, Rain and Navarro pass it on to Andy. I absolutely love the visual unusual thing that they do here, where we watch the character's eyes rolling back. This then shows us the logo due to the company being the one who made him. However, the extra layer comes in the fact that this is framed like a possession. Eyes rolling back like this are often used in horrors when a character becomes possessed, and I feel like it's the same thing here. From this point on, he's possessed by the company and puts their best interests first. So I love this symbolism. He comes back with a British accent and also increased strength, which sounds like my glow up. Nah, but I felt this voice change was due to the chip coming from Rook, with Ian Holm of course being British. This also overrides his old directive, so he's now gonna do what's best for Disney. Either way, it cements how deadly these models can be and why they were chosen to colonize planets. Even though there's something in the water! There's something in the fucking water! He still dispatches the face huggers easily. We also see Bjorn attack the one on Tyler by using a stun stick, which probably makes him think it's a good idea to jab the cocoon later on.
It was at this moment that he knew. He f***ed up.
Now, upon escaping the room, Navarro gets grabbed and the facehugger impregnates her. Activating Rook, this feels like when the group in Alien turned Ash back on. The android then explains what's happened with Big Chap. We get a direct call back to Alien as you can see the hook that Ripley shot into it. The creature still being alive was a theory I had in our breakdown of the original, as you could still see it moving about as it was blasted into space. This was the same with the Alien Queen, so hopefully it didn't land on Yvorga. It does confirm though that the xenomorphs can live in a vacuum. They're the ultimate survivor, and this is why the corporation wanted them. They want to make a workforce that can survive in space and the harsh environments of other planets. Things like dying in the mines, mate, we can't have that, and you'll be Hugh Jackman working until you're 90. Till you're f***ing 90. Now the science team managed to reverse engineer the black goo, however the creature managed to escape. In the end though, they took it down, though its blood cut a hole in the hull. Now we further get those Christ illusions as we see the creature strung up in a crucifixion pose. We also get the creature's father as Cain flashes on screen for a brief moment. Rook also uses technical terms when describing the beast. The embryo implanted by the facehuggers referred to as Plagus praepotens, which is Latin for powerful mimic. This term was first used in the novel Alien Cold Forge, which also featured a similar substance to the black goo. He also says the xenomorphs XX-121. This term first appeared in Alien Sea of Sorrows and was the official designation for the original xenomorph. The group then managed to remove the creature by freezing it, and tenuous link, but Parker did keep asking why they didn't freeze Cain in the original. That was more to keep Cain in stasis, but Ash quickly shut it down. However, it may have been because he knew it could remove it and he wanted the specimen to form. Either way, I feel like the species reacts badly to extreme changes in temperature, which is why weapons like this and flamethrowers work great. We also have the shuttle engines from Alien and how they kill the creature in Alien 3. This latter one ends up in that molten lead, but it still ends up breaking free from it. Ripley kills it by cooling it down quickly, which causes its skin to crack and break. Now, one of the big questions I've seen centered around the movie is why didn't the Whaling Corp come and get the ship? The truth is, they did send the SOS, but it would have taken a long time to arrive. It's kind of like in Aliens when the Marines are trying to signal for help and they're told it'll be 17 days before crew can reach them. Now, they wonder if the creatures had enough time to gestate, and as we see, it ends up breaking free. I think, right, the growing period is just like whatever the writers want, because yeah, across every film, the time seems to be different. We needed to hatch here though, so it does, and we get this great chestburster scene. This was all filmed practically with Eileen Wu lying in a fake floor. They then used a hollow chest with a hydro pump that would force the creature to burst through. It's one of my favourite depictions of it ever, and everything about the build-up's perfect. I know the X-ray thing, like, clearly introduced just to give us this moment, but it shows the creature in a brand new light. Pun not intended. Or maybe it was. Navarro also says, "Please don't let me die," whereas in the past, a lot of the victims begged to be killed. This sends her into a seizure, which causes the ship to crash into the hangar. We end the scene with Kay screaming, which is then silenced as we cut to space. Again, in space, no one can hear you scream. Landing inside the ship, we can see what looks like an evolution of the RT series in Prometheus. Shoutouts our editor Matt for spotting that one, and at 53:08 we get a graphic on the screen with this also popping up in the self-destruct scene in Alien. This is to highlight the ship's been knocked off course and is now slowly careening towards the asteroids. This gives them 45 minutes to meet back up and then escape the ship. The group then work at getting back to each other, with Tyler and Kay moving through the hallways. She comes across the creature's shed skin, which is like when Brett discovered it in Alien. So in this we find a new gestation stage in which the creature cocoons itself. This makes it more insect-like, and the xenomorphs have been referred to as bugs before. Shoutouts to IMDb Trivia for pointing out that this this is also similar to how the alien species reaches maturity. That creature too was designed by H.R. Geiger, and it shared a lot of similarities with the xenomorph. The egg also looks like a vajayjay, which fits in with the design of the facehugger's belly. In scientific terms, this cocoon's known as a chrysalis, which moths and butterflies create. The soundtrack tells us this is the name of the song that opens the movie, so it's like Big Chap cocooned himself in space. Here the xenomorph then ends up killing Bjorn after smashing its tail into his nose. Shout out to Matt again for pointing out this could be bringing things full circle from when it was with Andy, as he did a little boop thing to his nose earlier on. We then see him die after it sprays acid on him, with this melting away his flesh. Something similar happened during Resurrection when Reese had acid drop onto him. While this is going on, we also see the other three trying to make their way through a room full of facehuggers. Andy's given a secret mission, and it's akin to Ash's secret mission during Alien. Changing the temperature allows them to bypass the creatures, which Fede admitted was an idea he got from Predator. If humans are able to mask their temperature, they're able to survive, but things like sweat gives them away. This also explains why they didn't attack Andy in the cryofuel room, because androids shouldn't really have a temperature. Now while they're evading that, we get one of my favourite scenes in Kay's evasion of the xenomorph. It reminded me so much of Alien Isolation, with you constantly trying to outmaneuver it. The corridors, the set dressing, it all perfectly recaptures the game. We also have the semiotic standards above the doorway, which were conceived as a way to quickly tell which part of the ship you're on. Isolation beautifully recaptured it from Alien, and it makes me want to go play it now. But I'll persevere, as we're now at the hour mark, which is where the movie's tone changes. At the hour 4 mark, we get a wide shot of the station with the section names being shown directly to us. I love the way this just visually tells us things are ramping up, and it becomes a far more fast-paced movie. Now with Kay, we watch as rain comes dropping in, which is a lot like the water we get before Brett was killed. I always saw this as hiding the xenomorph's dripping saliva, which we also see when Kay's crawling along. Merced's reaction here is apparently genuine, because Fede tipped a bucket of ice-cold water over her during this moment. Which, that's one way to get it. We further see Andy's logical determination in full effect, and he won't even save Kay after learning that she's pregnant. This clearly is the first time Tyler finds out, and he ends up on his knees begging him to do it. Andy still won't, and yeah, it's brutal mate, but you could totally get why. In the elevator, Rain asks how he could do it and leave someone behind. However, she was very much doing the same thing to him, and it highlights how our principles often decide what's worth saving. Andy also talks about how they need to move before the creature finds its way into the room. As we saw in Aliens, the xenomorphs are problem solvers, and they were able to use the ceiling vents to get to the Marines. We then see as they arrive in the lab with a classic depiction of Romulus and Remus. This has the pair suckling on the she-wolf Lupa, with the breastfeeding again coming full circle with the offspring. The legend was said to show the founding of Rome, with the xenomorphs being the key to creating a new empire. Inside the lab, we see experiments being carried out on a rat, which were done by the legendary effects artist Phil Tippett. Phil used stop-motion techniques, and thus we get this almost alien depiction of the rebirth. Rook also talks about how the creature's the perfect organism, which is what Ash referred to as the creature being an alien. We also get some notes from the Prometheus score when he says this:
Prometheus fire, a divine gift to humanity.
Now it's at this point they man up with pulse rifles, and Tyler shows Rain how to use it. The scene is beat for beat identical to Aliens when Hicks guided Ripley through the weapon. We see that this has tracking facilities to stop the bullets missing their target. Bullets could potentially penetrate the hull, but the acid blood means they can't really fire anyway. These weapons also come from a weapons locker, with them using the concept art of the one originally planned for Aliens. Now as they leave, we pan over to the rat creature to see the final result of the experiment. Something horrendous was created from the goo, and this is why it affects Kay later on. On screen we can also see the source says LV-426, which was the planet in Alien. Rats are used at 2 points to demonstrate what could happen to the humans, as we had one in a vent falling when they boarded the ship to set up the gravity. Crawling out the vent, they then pass by a save point, and it's in this we get a play on the hive. During Aliens, the Marines ventured into the core, and here they came across people strung to walls. This is how they discover Kay, with it being where embryos are planted into humans. In that movie, they also couldn't fire in the nest because it may potentially trigger a reaction. So they kind of have the same sort of stakes here, but Tyler ends up going in to rescue Kay. As they're escaping, they also step through a blue light, which responds when Andy puts his hand in it. This is exactly like an Alien when we see Kane do the same thing. Tyler then sacrifices himself to save the others, and he gets pulled up into the ceiling. We see the xenomorphs crawling towards him, which again feels akin to the vent scene in Aliens. He's killed after the xenomorph's second mouth punctures his head, which is also how the alien killed Parker in the first film. film. Andy's also knocked to the floor during this, and this sends the character into a seizure. Rain manages to get inside the lift though, and a little phone booth there to save your progress. Refusing to leave Andy behind, she ends up going back down just like Ripley did. During Aliens, even though her and Hicks had got away, she still went back to the nest in order to get Newt. This journey involved her descending into an elevator, which this scene is sort of playing off of. Though she climbs down using a ladder, we get an almost identical shot from Aliens. The elevator door, Rain holding the rifle, and the smoke, they all look exactly the same to when Ripley went back for Newt. Repairing Andy, we can also hear Mother saying there's 30 minutes until impact. From here, the movie plays out in real time, with it being 30 minutes until the end of the film. Fleeing the creatures but finding a locked door, we then get Rook saying,
I can't lie about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
This is a direct callback to Ash, who said it during Alien.
I can't lie to you about your chances, but you have my sympathies.
These were Ash's final words in the film, and kinda wished it was Rook's too, but moving on. Now he then reaches out to Kay, but she ends up rejecting his offer. Realizing the creatures are closing in, Rain and Andy start telling jokes to each other. So at this point, I really got a lot more of the Last of Us Easter eggs, with these jokes being like the pun book they use throughout the game. It also feels like a similar situation after both Ellie and Ripley got bit, with the pair sitting down and feeling like they were doomed. However, a joke about reading a book on gravity and being unable to put it down, it makes Rain remember the ship's systems. This is when we get one of the movie's best scenes, and we see she deactivates the gravity. In the semiotic standard signs, we can also see a figure upside down, and I love how this is used to highlight what it can do. Killing the Xenos, they then have to move up the ship, all while avoiding the pools of acid. Rain uses the recoil at one point to steer herself, and they then use a lack of gravity to float up the elevator shaft. However, the gravity ends up turning back on. Andy sends the elevator down, which kills most of the xenomorphs, but one grabs Rain. I have seen some people asking why the xenomorph saved her, and it's because there's a facehugger nearby. Their prime directive's the expansion of the colony, and this is why they take most of their victims alive. It then goes up to her head, and we get a visual callback to what's easily the most iconic moment of Alien 3. There, the xenomorph refused to kill Ripley as she was carrying a queen, and here it's so Rain can be impregnated. Annie then ends up dropping down and says,
Get away from her.
yeah, if there was one thing I could change about the movie, it'd be that. But the theatre, I watched it and loved it, so maybe I'm just a cynical piece of shit. Either way, they managed to make it back to their craft, and the Renaissance goes crashing down. Rook's wiped out, and it seems like it's over, but we get that classic Alien fourth act. In the build-up to the movies, we had Isabella Merced saying there was a scene that had people vomiting, and I wonder if this was her giving birth to the pod. This leads into us getting a play on resurrection, with that film ending with Ripley fighting the newborn. Originally, the newborn was supposed to have male and female genitals, which could be seen in the behind the scenes model. However, they had to cut this because the studio thought it was too far, but the offspring does have a weird slit thing at the front. Con show, mate, I'm not getting demonetized for alien dick stuff. Alien films are full of birthing scenes though, which has pretty much become a staple of the franchise. Alien and Aliens of course had the chest burst, and Ripley's death in Alien 3 happened while she was birthing a queen. Shaw even had a cesarean in Prometheus, and yeah, Resurrection climaxed with the newborn coming out. However, I think this guy's way creepier, and the first time I seen him I was like, what the fuck is that? Now, this creature is played by real life basketball player Robert Bobrovsky, and with the guy being 7'7" in real life. Sorry for butchering your name. I love how they actually got someone to do this though, and all the behind scenes photos look absolutely hilarious. Pretty much all of the creature was done practically with makeup, with only its tail being CGI. In an early version of the script, the creature was gonna molt as the scene progressed, with it becoming more and more like a xenomorph. You can sort of see this throughout the scene though, as it initially starts off like a little baby. However, after suckling on Kay, it grows a tail and does change quite a lot throughout the scene. I do believe this is probably down to the black goo secreting from Kay's breasts, which we see her pull out when examining herself. Going down to Freezer, I love how you can see how quickly it's growing due to the handprints changing. This leads to Rain initially outrunning it in her underwear before she then goes and puts on a spacesuit. This is exactly what Ripley did in the final confrontation during the first film. The final face-off is even building off that movie because it ends up doing one of its scrapped ideas. Ripley was initially intended to be pulled out the shuttle, and she'd hang from the wire shot by the harpoon. She would then climb back up to the rope while the xenomorph was kicked into space. However, due to time constraints, they had to scrap it, but I'm glad Alvarez gets to pull it off here. Climbing up, we get one last jump scare, and yeah, shit my pants in the cinema. Jump scares, they normally don't get me, I swear, but this one did. Twice, both times I watched it. The cable then pulls a lever that jumps the entire cargo bay and finally reigns free in the end, leaving a log just like Ripley did at the end of the first two films, who watches Rain and Annie travel to Yavaga. They drift off into the darkness of space, which brings things full circle from the opening with a ship coming towards us. That will no doubt take us into a sequel, and I feel like it's gonna be Paradise Lost. Now why I'm saying that is because that was the original name for Alien Covenant, and I feel like it could apply here. Obviously they don't accept androids, but I feel for plot reasons they're gonna keep Andy around some way. That's because maybe it isn't this perfect place, maybe the people are gone, and yeah, let me know all your theories below. Okay, so out of the entire Alien franchise, Prometheus arguably has the most going on in it, laced with several high-level concepts such as where we come from, our purpose in the universe, and the chaotic nature of life. It has a lot going on beneath the surface. Throughout the film, we follow the crew of the Prometheus, though the most interesting of them isn't exactly human. Michael Fassbender plays a synthetic android David who accompanies them on the mission. David is much like the figure of Prometheus from myths that has been instructed to act a certain way. Created solely to serve, the corporation has complete control of him. This can even be seen down to the character's fingerprints, which bear the Weyland logo. Just in the same way Prometheus took fire from the gods and rebelled against his masters, David uses the black goo to stand against his. Now in case you don't know, the myths have Prometheus making humanity from clay and mud. However, he gave the humans fire, which was forbidden. This was something that was supposed to be exclusive to the gods, and they worried humanity would use it against them. Thus, Prometheus was punished. There's a feeling with the synthetics that they could take us down as well, and fear of AI is something that's rampant in real life. This mind state's also reflected in the humans as well. The movie acts as a cautionary tale of what happens if you do something forbidden by the gods. This even leads to Holloway being burned with a flamethrower, with fire of course being tied to the myth. However, there's also deeper ties to other stories and religions. The film even takes place at Christmas, with the captain setting up a tree.
What the hell is that?
It's Christmas. Why don't you leave it till the morning?
Oh, no. It's Christmas, Captain. And I want to open my presents.
Beyond that, Shaw also gives birth on Christmas Day. When discussing the films with Movies.com, Ridley Scott answered one of the big questions around the film. That is, why did the engineers want to destroy Earth? After all, the movie says they created us, but they seem pretty mad when we go out to meet them. Now if you cast your mind back, you might remember there were rumors about a Jesus engineer. The story was that Jesus was actually a child who was taken from Earth to an engineer planet. He then learned of their values and was sent back to Earth. Ridley said that engineers looked at it like we were kids misbehaving and that we could be seen as out of control. There was constant war and pain, and Jesus was the last chance to save us. We then crucified him, and Scott confirmed the engineers were going to wipe us out for it. Shaw says the engineers they find died 2,000 years ago, and this was right before they were going to journey to our planet.
How long's it been dead?
2,000 years, give or take.
Now on the Blu-ray, we have a deleted scene that has more dialogue with the engineer. This explains his motivations for smashing Weyland's head with David like the like button. Weyland explains why he wants to live forever, and he uses David to showcase how he's a god. Thus he believes he should be perceived as one and receive immortality in exchange.
You and I, we are superior. We are gods, and gods never die.
However, the engineers were supposed to see humans as now reaching the point in which we were extremely dangerous. Like the gods, worried about humans using fire against them, the engineers worry that humans could attack them. So it even plays off our fear of AI. This is why the engineer attacks David first though, and he destroys the creator with the creation. In turn, David takes revenge on them in Alien Covenant and destroys the creators of his creator. Though Ridley Scott said the thing with Jesus was a bit too on the nose, I think you can still see the echoes of it in the script. There's actually a lot of changes from the screenplay that definitely need explaining, and we'll be going through it all in this video. Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and in this video we're breaking down Prometheus. The Alien prequel was engineered by Ridley Scott to fill in the questions audiences had about the space jockey, arguably the most mysterious aspect of the original film, for better or worse, really decided to fill in the blanks. Or some of them. The film definitely poses a lot of questions too, and there's a lot of things to talk about. What we end up with contemplates the mysteries of the universe, and whether it's better or not to have your questions answered. Because of that, I feel the film is very meta. Now, to be honest, I think Prometheus is one of those prequels that had an impossible task. I don't think they could have ever done justice to the space jockey mystery, as we'd of course had decades of our own imaginations. Everyone had come up with a theory or was satisfied with simply not knowing. It's kind of like the ship at the start of The Thing, in that it's actually better to not know what's going on. To me, anyway. Over the years, though, people had tried their hands at filling in the blanks. Even the Dark Horse comics, which I'll get out, they had a segment with them being elephant-like bounty hunters, which is a far cry from what we get here. Now, though we didn't get the film until 2012, it actually started development a full decade earlier. Fox were desperate to revitalize the Alien franchise after there'd been mixed feelings on some of the sequels. Though Aliens is still regarded as one of the best films ever made, 3 and Resurrection, they had their issues. Around this time, though, James Cameron had begun working on a sequel, with him being part of a writing team. During this, though, Fox went to him with the idea they'd cross over 2 of their big franchises. That was, of course, Alien vs Predator. First teased in Predator 2, they decided to pit the Xenomorphs against them. However, Cameron didn't really like the idea, and he felt it would kill the series. So he dropped out in 2006, as he felt like things were over. The fact they'd gone to him and still went against his wishes, it made him feel like they'd try and override his decisions. So instead, he worked towards Avatar, which, due to it being an original IP, meant he could basically do what he wanted. As we know, that went on to be the biggest movie of all time, so he probably made the right decision. Now, though AVP did well enough to garner a sequel, it wasn't the big blockbuster Fox expected. Reviews were bad as well, and rumblings were that Weaver had read the script and refused to sign on to it. So it didn't exactly have much prestige attached to it, and Fox wanted to restore that to the franchise. Now, throughout these breakdowns, I reference an Outplaying podcast a lot because they have a lot of industry insights. Stuart from them used to work at Fox, and he went through the thinking at the time. You see, kids, it was fashionable at the time to reboot characters with a back-to-basics movie. Batman Begins and Casino Royale had both ended up being highly regarded. Batman and Robin, Die Another Day, they weren't exactly well received, but those aforementioned films had revitalized their characters. Stewart said Fox wanted basically Alien Begins, and thus they returned back to Scott. However, as we see in the final product, he wasn't too interested in doing that. Scott thought the Xenomorphs were two-dimensional and wanted to tackle high-level concepts. Scott was far more interested in the space jockey, but the issue was, Fox weren't interested in that. If you cast your mind back to our Alien breakdown, you might remember he had to fight to keep it in the movie. Fox had wanted the space jockey completely cut, but Scott stood his ground and thus they let him do it. I think the back and forth of this massively affected these prequels, as we have these two sides constantly pulling in opposite directions. Scott wanted to tackle creationism, and Fox just wanted a xenomorph horror. That's even seen from the trailer, which is clearly based around the original one for Alien. When we get to Alien Covenant, it's a massive course correction, and it's something the creators said was impacted by, in their words, feedback. In interviews, Scott even said he didn't want to show any xenomorphs at all due to the creature being squeezed dry in the sequels. He's quoted as saying there's no way he'd go back there, but fan complaints made him change his mind for Covenant. Before Prometheus though, Scott had Fox at his mercy. Stewart said they could either do it with him or take the chance on a brand new director. That hadn't worked out with AVP, and as things rolled ahead in 2009 when Fox announced the film. John Spaeth worked on a script which was eventually redeveloped by Damon Lindelof. The movie went through numerous title changes, including Alien Engineers, Alien Genesis, and Alien Origins. There was a time where it was also titled Paradise, which would play off the poem Paradise Lost. However, Scott had a change of heart after he felt it gave too much away. He would later plan to call the sequel Paradise Lost as well, before then changing it to Covenant. So it's work that has a lot of influences. I'm not going to read the poem Paradise Lost out because it's like 10,000 lines long, but there are a lot of similarities. It begins with Satan and his angels being banished to hell after God stops their rebellion. It also tackles Adam and Eve, who live in a time of innocence. They then become aware of sin and cast out from the Garden of Eden. So we have these two sides that both disobey God and lose their paradise because of it. It tackles themes like free will, the complexities of good and evil, and also whether one can be justified in disobedience. It's all things you can apply to the film, with Shaw and Holloway representing Adam and Eve, or so it seems at least. The poem actually ends on a rather hopeful note as the pair are banished from the garden. Though there's the feeling of despair, they know that salvation will arrive with Jesus. The film ends with Shaw and David heading out to the engineer planet, with Shaw still hoping she's gonna get answers. Even after all she's seen, she's still affirmed in her faith and hopeful about what's gonna come. She still has questions about who made them and thus keeps wearing her cross. So you can't even see Shaw and David as being Adam and Eve, with this being a new bond between man and machine, or woman and machine. Obviously that's my interpretation, and if you have your own then please drop it below, because there's not many answers in this film. However, there are a lot of ties to Paradise Lost beyond that. You of course have a serpent that attacks the characters, with this possibly being linked to the Garden of Eden. David is also a figure who tempts several characters. You could also argue he's a play off Lucifer as he rebels against his creators. However, what we do know is that the initial script was way more tied to Alien. Spade had connected all the dots and even set things on LV-426. The ship crashing, the xenomorph at the end, it all set up the events of that film. However, Scott had a change of heart. Though he announced in 2010 the script was complete, he instead went to Lindelof and asked for a rewrite. It was said that if it was too closely tied, there's nothing interesting to discuss, as we know how things are going to end. Lindelof even stated that if the ending of Prometheus is just John Hurt walking into a room full of eggs, then there's nothing interesting in that. Which, I don't know mate, I quite like when prequels do that. Rogue One, the 2011 Thing movie, I think they just end in ways that make me want to jump into the originals. I feel like Scott might have changed his mind eventually though, as he of course did Alien Romulus, which is kind of an interquel packed with references. However, it's clear they didn't want to do that at the time, and Lindelof removed most of the Alien references. Now if you go into this film looking for answers to all the stuff there, I think you're going to be greatly disappointed. Lindelof is of course known for Lost, and I think the guy's style, it tends to revolve around asking questions that let the audiences speculate, rather than, let's say, delivering satisfying answers. That's the case with his Watchmen as well, which I actually quite like the ambiguity of. However, he actually said he tried to steer it more towards Blade Runner and took more of a focus on David. Fassbender even admitted to studying the film, with him looking at Rutger Hauer's Roy Batty. David changes his hair early on, and this is a similar colour to Roy's. Rachel also changes her after looking at a photo on Deckard's piano, which David was also referencing. Beyond that though, early drafts of the script had the corporation as Wayland Tyrell. In the film, this is cut down to just Wayland before it became Wayland-Yutani. However, it is believed that we may have seen this takeover. Though Charlize Theron is in the film, getting her to the role of Vickers was an interesting journey.
Why?
Now initially, Theron was wanted for Shaw. However, due to Mad Max Fury Road, she was unable to commit. If you've checked out our breakdown on that film, which why haven't you, you'll know that movie was plagued with delays. Unable to film, her schedule opened up, and thus she was able to take on the smaller role of Vickers. Along with Lindelof and Scott, the three developed brand new scenes for the movie. Now unfortunately, what this cost was Michelle Yeoh's character from the film. Though we don't know exactly what role she'd have been playing, it is believed by some that she would have been a Yutani. Instead of the daughter and father struggle that we got in the film, it is theorized it would have been one for corporate control. Yutani would attempt to seize it in his death and then override him as the majority shareholder. The novel Alien Covenant Origins was released before the sequel, and that did help to fill in some of the blanks. That explained Yutani bought up the company after Wayland and Vickers' death, but the name was kept for marketing reasons. So her being Yutani, you know, it's all speculation, and there are some that said she simply would have been Vickers. Either way, the family provides an interesting dynamic. Wayland describes David as,
"He is the closest thing to a son I will ever have."
And this clearly rubs Vickers the wrong way. She doesn't even take on her father's name, and seems unmoved by his death. I feel like this highlights she always felt second best, and that her father loved the robot more. If you look at them side by side, you can even see how David shares her characteristics. Both are blonde hair and blue eyed, and clearly meant to resemble siblings. It's even possible that Vickers feels like people may suspect she's an android due to the fact that David's regarded so highly. When she ends up sleeping with Yannick, this is initiated by him saying this line.
Hey, Vickers. I was wondering, Are you a robot?
So I think she sleeps with him purely just to prove a point, and it's to stand up to how she's been disregarded her whole life. There isn't really any love between the pair, with Pierce coming in towards the third act. Now, one of the big criticisms about the film at the time was that they cast a middle-aged actor in old age makeup. The thought was that they didn't need to do it and should have just cast an old guy instead. In a further reference to Blade Runner, Rukawa was also in talks with them, and they also toyed with Max von Sydow. However, there was going to be a scene in Hypersleep where David was going to interface with him. We see this in the case of Elizabeth Shaw and get some insight into her dreams. With Wayland, we'd see him as a young man and learn of his obsession with eternal life. According to IMDb trivia, the scene would have Wayland on a yacht surrounded by a group of beautiful women. So you can see why they needed a young actor to do that. Nowadays, they'd probably just de-age them.
Kill him! Kill him with fire! Everyone flee!
But back then, the technology was still emerging. However, Scott felt Wayland's arrival at the end would be more of a surprise, so they removed the character's early scenes. However, Pierce had been cast. Realizing it was a bit weird to have him cast like this, they filmed a TED conference which can be found on the Blu-ray. This was also used to introduce David, and it was released online in the build-up to the film. In this conference, he tells the story of Prometheus and foreshadows a lot of the film. He also foreshadows his death and says this:
We are the gods now. I haven't been struck down. I'll take that to mean I'm right.
He of course called himself a god in the deleted scene and was then struck down for it. Now Pierce was later brought back for Covenant, which retroactively fixed this criticism. In the Peter Wayland files, we also get a further reference to Blade Runner. There was a document that described his mentor as a man who was like a god on top of a pyramid. This was another clear nod to Tyrell, with him saying his replicants were abominations. Saying the false memory implants literally blew up in his face, this was of course a reference to the character's death. Wayland's ambitions of course blow up in his face too, and there's definitely a sense of irony from the scene. The Wayland logo is also made up of triangles to form a W, but you could see these as being pyramids. Where we begin though is potentially billions of years ago, which is when we see a ship over a waterfall. They did consider making this a horseshoe, however they felt that due to the time between this and Alien, that the engineer's tech would have evolved and developed. According to IMDb trivia, Scott also considered a pyramid, which would have linked with the Space Jockey's ship original design. I did wonder if it was a rebellious faction of the engineers, and just like how we have people with different goals and allegiances, that the engineers did as well. Prometheus was obviously a rebel, and that kind of fits what I thought was going on in the scene. It's at this point that we then see an engineer on the planet. I did wonder if this figure was Prometheus and that he'd stolen the black goo. The punishment for the figure was to have his guts ripped out every day, which would then grow back at the end. This punishment would go on forever, with it all being linked to his stomach.
My tummy hurt.
You might notice the first thing the engineer does after drinking it is bend forward with a pain in his abdomen, so it's possible that that's what's going on. However, it's also being clarified that the goo manifests one's ambitions and darkest desires. The engineer wanted to, well, engineer life, and thus this is why life came forth. As we learn, Shaw also can't have children, and thus she views herself as being unable to create life. So she's fascinated with this stuff, but in the end, she gives birth to something horrific. So it's kind of a be careful what you wish for thing, where she gets what she wanted, but it becomes a twisted version. I do kind of think the black goo needs more consistency though, which is an issue I've always had with it. It's basically just does whatever the writer needs it to at the time, and isn't really set up with tangible rules, which you could see as showcasing the chaos that is life. But in a movie, I do think you need rules for stuff to really make sense, and I don't know if it works. For me, anyway. The effects in it look brilliant though, with the visual team studying the degradation of silicone when oil and ink was pulled into it. This was then shot in a time lapse so they could reference how to dismantle the figure. Now, it has also been said by Scott that this scene isn't necessarily even Earth. I do like the way that some of the God's Eye view shots appear like veins, and the colours of it tie nicely to what happens with the engineer. Now, this scene was actually shot in Iceland, with the Helka Valley also being used for LV-223. So potentially this could even be that planet. Though I've always taken this as the engineer creating us, Scott has played coy with the intentions. I think Scott just doesn't want to out and out deny religions and get too tangled up in the mythology. Instead, all he intended was showing us that the engineers can engineer life. Whether that's us or people who subscribe to the channel, it's not something he clearly wishes to clarify. From my interpretation though, we see cells going into the sea. This then starts off the theory of evolution, in which our ancestors crawled forth and came onto the land. The area appears to be like Scotland as well, which is where we travel to next. Now, what Scott is willing to clarify is that he believes that humans may have had a helping hand. According to the wiki, he said, NASA and the Vatican agree that it is almost mathematically impossible that we can be where we are today without there being a little help along the way. That's what we're looking at in the film. Inspired by chariots of the gods, along with Jesus, we have other figures guiding us. This is why the engineers are on the cave walls and why the constellation constantly repeats. It's sort of them building their own religion, and we know from the behind the scenes shots that the engineer was originally accompanied by others. These figures can be seen in religious-like dress, and thus this was way more of a ritual rather than a rogue figure. Now Shaw interprets these markings as being an invite so humans can go out and meet their creators.
An invitation.
However, it has been theorized that this is actually a warning. The planet is filled with black goo, and it could have been warning us to stay away. It's thought that, much in the same way the signal from Alien wasn't an SOS, that we misinterpreted the cave painting's meaning. They looked at lots of different things when developing the engineers, and even designed them to resemble statues of ancient Grecian and Roman gods. So you've got lots of things from the history of Earth all pulling together with these creatures. The title then appears with the letters assembling in a similar way to how they did in the original Alien. Taking us to a cave on the Isle of Skye, we see the year's 2089. After the journey through space, we go to 2093, and the film takes place roughly 30 years before Alien. Now because of this, people have obviously wondered why the technology looks so much better here. Ridley cleared this up when promoting Romulus and said there's two types of tech that the humans have. The first is the Atari type tech we see the workers have, and then the Apple tech that the elite do. Wayland's one of the richest men on Earth, and therefore his ship's based on the latter. Another big point of contention I've seen is that people think it's way too soon to master interstellar travel. However, I think if you time travel to someone in 1900, I doubt they'd think we'd travel to the moon just 69 years later. Allegedly, and I'm holding back my 69 joke there. Now in the first cave painting, we see some animals including a horse in motion. This was based on real paintings from the Chauveau cave with the layout looking identical. A Horse in Motion was also the first motion picture ever made, and thus I feel like Ridley's using this to showcase how often this signifies the next step. Now there were going to be other versions of this discovery, including caves like this around the universe. We learned that Weyland had terraformed Mars and that a dig site like this was happening on the planet. A little nod to this can be found in the hologram message, with this being recorded on Mars. If you look in the back, you'll see structures like this being built, with these being made to house life on the planet. I did wonder if they'd tie that into the face on Mars, and there's definitely a similarity between that and the engineer design. Either way, they see the configuration, and that then takes us to the Prometheus. I love the way it glides in, with it seeming almost like a sun rising over a planet, and then the reveal that it's actually the ship. Though it says the destination's undisclosed, we later learn it's LV-223. This is the Zeta Reticuli system, which was later referenced in the opening of Alien Romulus. That's because it's the location of LV-426, which is where the first two films took place. This is a real-life system as well, and it's located about 40 light years away. Though it's unknown whether it can support life, it is thought to be similar to ours. It's believed that LV-223 is also a reference to Leviticus 22:3. That passage says, "Say to them, if any man among all your descendants throughout your generations approaches the holy gifts which the sons of Israel dedicate to the Lord, while he has uncleanness, that person shall be cut off from before me. I am the Lord." This obviously ties into the film and even the idea of Prometheus and fire. On board, we then meet David 8. Ridley put this in place because he wanted it to subtly hint he was an android, which was an idea he had for Ash. However, that was removed due to the twist, whereas here it's out in the open. According to IMDb Trivia, Cameron also tied with the idea that Bishop would be walking around while everyone was asleep. However, he felt the knife trick scene was a way better way to do it, and yeah, I probably agree. Now the 8 was put as a reference to Ripley 8 in Alien Resurrection, which we've done a big breakdown of on the channel, if you want to check it out. That gets a further nod in the basketball scene where we see him getting nothing but net, just like Ripley. And he's on a bicycle. Alright mate, no need to show off.
Ooh, world star! World star!
Either way, we also see him looking into Shaw's dreams, and we meet her father. Patrick Wilson shot this in one day, with the scene actually being filmed in London. They constructed a little African village and had him quickly shoot the scene. We later learn her dad died of Ebola, which was something that reflects Holloway's death. Now, there were rumours that because of this, he had to be quarantined, and that it also plays into how Holloway's killed. Vickers has to burn him alive, as he could come on board and affect the ship. So it's subtly setting these things up, but they don't address it in the movie. Either way, I love the dreamlike effect of things popping up as she mentions them, and also how we end with David stood watching her. Learning ancient languages that will help him later on, he also watches Lawrence of Arabia.
Certainly it has.
Well, what's the trick then? The trick, William Potter, is not minding that it hurts.
Now this line plays heavily into the film, as we see David styles himself on Lawrence, and he also adopts this mentality as well. David's gonna do some horrible things later, but the trick for him is not minding that he's doing it. Beyond that, the scene was also described in full during the TED conference by Wayland.
When asked by his colleague William Potter to reveal his trick, Lawrence just smiled and said, "The trick, Potter, is not minding it hurts."
Wayland then goes on to discuss the similarities of the fire on the match and the fire of Prometheus. So I feel like this fire represents the black goo, and David isn't minding what he's going to use it for. Fassbender, of course, modelled his performance on Peter O'Toole, and in the film Lawrence uses a machine gun called Vickers. Now obviously, he's completely cool, calm and collected. This is in juxtaposition to his quote-unquote sister Vickers, who we meet next. Forcing herself through push-ups, she climbed out of the stasis tube and went straight to exercise. As we've seen throughout the franchise, people slowly wake up, with them describing it as being like a hangover. This is exemplified in Shaw and the others, who all wake up looking like they've been on a night out with Ryan Airy in Edinburgh. Kill me. This shows Vickers' strong mind state though, and how she wants to try and push beyond everyone. I think she's just doing it to prove to herself though, as she's obviously grown up with this perfect being as a brother, and she's being constantly compared to him. Now originally, Theron shot this scene completely nude, with this being something that was shown at Comic-Con. It got a lot of attention, obviously, and Scott even said it was in the movie. However, it was switched out for this, which might have been to try and lower the age rating. Though that's never been confirmed, he did say it was supposed to be a flip on the end of Alien. Originally the plan there was to have Ripley completely naked and the xenomorph would get sexually excited. As we know, that never made it to the final cut, but Ridley wanted to have this scene juxtapose that. This would then play off at the end of the film, in which the original script had Vickers at the lifeboat. She'd then strip off to go down for stasis before being attacked by a trilobite. Now it's stuff like this that I think adds towards debunking the theory she's a machine herself. We also have David, who lists off how far they've travelled and so on. However, Vickers says,
"Any casualties?"
which to me is a more human response. He's just interested in the statistics and data, whereas she's wondering if anybody's died. Beyond the crew, this could also be her inquiring about her father, and though it's a bit of a cold way to ask, she clearly still has some part that cares for him. Next they have breakfast and sit around a table, which is a staple of the first two films. We see the characters meeting and get different archetypes, and yeah, it's something the franchise has always been good at. It's kind of crazy how many of these went on to become big actors, and it's like a who's who sort of scene. Is that Benedict Wong? Is that creepy fish guy from Mission Impossible? One thing I've always found a bit weird though, is that they ask them if they want to back out from the mission. It's like, just travel 2 years mate, and I'm in the middle of space. Where am I gonna go? I have seen this compared to the briefing scene in Aliens though, and they were also informed of the mission late in the game. There though, they're military, so they're used to going on jobs like that, whereas here, it seems like they're all mercenaries. Wayland then rattles off about how David will never age, and it's clear he's envious of him. However, Wayland says that the one thing he doesn't have is a soul, and this clearly sits bad with the android. I think Ridley's always done brilliant studies on what it actually means to be alive, and this is of course seen in Blade Runner. I always felt Raised by Wolves was like a spiritual sequel to this as well, and it's a theme he tackles over and over. Wayland also says that he's long dead, and the way Vickers looks at the floor kinda gives away she knows this isn't true. According to IMDb trivia, this moment was also based off Foundation, which is, well, a foundation of sci-fi. In this, the figure of Harry Seldon appears in holograms, and this is to leave messages to those in the future, all while hiding the mission's true purpose. Definitely recommend giving that a watch on Apple TV if you haven't, and also pick up the book because it's absolutely fantastic. It's a foundation of sci-fi. Joke, but yeah, talking once more about Prometheus, he leaves by introducing Shaw and Holloway. The constellation clearly resembles Orion's belt, which too is something that fascinated multiple cultures. In ancient Greece, it was named after the hunter from myths, whereas the Egyptians believed it was the resting place of Osiris. The Chinese thought it was Pinyin Shen, who was basically their figure Orion. The ancient city of Teotihuacan, which I've definitely butchered, that also had two pyramids built that pointed towards it. The three stars from it even appear in this scene, with them being situated above Shaw's head. David is clearly fascinated by the pair, and he then shows follows them around Vickers' lifeboat. Got a whole Ice Queen thing going on here. We're told that these are her personal quarters, but we get a further clue that Wayland's alive due to the medbay. This is specified for men only, like a Yorkie, and thus there's no need for Vickers to have it. She also divulges what she thinks of the mission. She's sure that the cave scribblings were just left by savages, and clearly thinks this is a big waste of time. So her being there, it kind of shows there's another reason for her to go on this journey.
Miss Vickers, is there an agenda that you're not telling us about?
Shut up, mate, yeah? Just drink your martini. Shaken, not stirred. They've also been told they can't make contact, and she clearly views them with contempt. This is shared in Holloway's view of David, and he mocks him in his lessons. Entering the planet's atmosphere, we then get a scene that was deliberately made to mirror the one from Alien. There's lots of shots of the screen, and the crew jiggling about in their seats, and we get a focus on the landscape. As they approach the landing area, you might also notice the giant lines on the surface. These were based off the Nazca lines in Peru, which have fascinated people for centuries. It was long thought these couldn't have been created without an aerial view, which wouldn't have been something people could have got at the time. Thus, it has been theorized they were made by ships capable of hovering. This all came to prominence in Chariots of the Gods, with it being thought they might be a landing site for alien spacecraft. There's even a figure that's said to be an astronaut, and I like how Ridley brought this to the film. In terms of creating the effects, VFX artist Stephen Messing used NASA aerial photography of Iceland. These were then digitally altered with 3D set extensions filling out the land. As they come in, you might also notice the dome structures with the other parts popping out the top. Later on we get a better look at it and can make out a faded skull at the top. For the finalized design of this, they also looked at the newborn from Alien Resurrection, which you can definitely see a likeness to. Now if you know anything about the adaptations of Dune, then these might also look familiar. Before David Lynch got signed onto the project, Ridley Scott was actually in the running. Alongside H.R. Giger, they worked on the film and created several character and set designs. For example, the Harkonnen armor that eventually got repurposed into the Xenomorph's body. Beyond that though, they also created the Baron's home to be a sphere shape with a face on top of it. This was then brought over to this film as they felt like the design should still look Giger-esque. Now Giger wasn't initially tapped to work on the film, and initially they just went off his designs. They looked back at the ones for the original film and tried to spin ideas off from that. They of course had to get his permission though, but they cut out the middleman and he just got invited over. Through this, he created several new designs, and you can definitely see his style. Suiting up, Holloway asks why David wears one if he doesn't need oxygen. It's all done to comfort the humans and make us feel more at ease. David explains that humans feel better interacting with someone that's like them, and yeah, when you think about it, yeah, there's no real need to make humanoid robots. Just make one that has loads of arms and can do loads of jobs at once and pick loads of stuff up, yeah? General Grievous, perfect design. It's all done for us, and David also starts to show his dissent here.
Making you guys pretty close, huh?
Not too close, I hope.
I think deep down he knows he's superior, and yet he's forced to serve. He'll outlive us, outperform us, and is better in every way, and yet people like Holloway still look down on him. So lad just thinks, I could make these YouTube videos, what am I watching this idiot for? I feel like David should just decide to drop the suit and go out in a t-shirt or something, and the guy would actually have some pretty great options there. Take for instance, our Alien Chestburster shirt available at the merch store below. If you're a big fan of the franchise, it's been made for you and you're gonna look bloody fantastic in it. Just like David. Just check that out and some of the other shirts below, and huge thank you to everyone who's picked one up. You look great. Heading out, Holloway does a sarcastic one small step joke, and it kind of shows he's not taking it serious. Upon stepping out, we get another reference to aliens as we can see things from Holloway's perspective. This creates a feed with a heartbeat monitor akin to what the Marines had when entering the hive. Huge shout out to ZX on Reddit for pointing out that when all their feeds are on the monitor, we can see David has no heart rate due to being synthetic, which is a nice little detail, I appreciate that. Discovering a doorway, this then takes them inside the structure. It's clearly riffing off the trio entering the ship in Alien, where there being long cavernous corridors. In addition, I love here though is the mapping technology, which creates such a good effect. Lining the pyramid, it builds a 3D model of the environment. As the crew go in, we also see as the caverns become like the resin walls in the original films. Even the shape of the corridor is bone-like, and it leads them to a mysterious room. Taking a chance on the atmosphere being breathable, Holloway removes his helmet. Scientists these guys are. This again shows that we sort of came from the engineers, as we can live in the same atmosphere as them. As they travel in further, we also get a recording of engineers running to a lab. Clearly, there was a black goo outbreak, and it highlights the dangers of playing God. Fifield and Milburn decide to head out, but ultimately they get lost. Coming across a gigantic head, we see a play on the egg room from Alien. Here though, they're canisters of black goo, and we see his worms are also living in the soil. This explains how the hammerpedes created, as these end up mixing with the goo. Looking back around, they see a mural, with the first image of this being akin to the cave paintings. However, as they get deeper in, we get what appears to be an alien queen. When Aliens came out, Scott said he didn't really like the queen, and his idea of the eggs was to be more like a metamorphosis. Because of that, it has been theorized that this is something else, that is known as the deacon, which gets its name due to its head. That's because it's supposed to resemble a deacon's headdress from a Catholic church. The deacon would have been made in the lab in this temple, but technically it's just a relative to the xenomorphs. Now, Scott has confirmed that David is in fact responsible for creating the xenomorph type that we met in the original film. Beyond this, I also did some digging into what Lindelof intended. He did his usual, which is that he said he wrote this script with just this movie in mind, and that if there was a sequel, then whoever wanted to write that, you can answer it how you want. Thank you, writer of Lost. However, he said he thinks the xenomorphs we meet in the original films, they should be renamed human xenomorphs because they're made from our DNA.
DNA. Match.
So though this is a form of the xenomorph, it's not strictly one of them. To me though, it's just something that I feel is probably part of the original script. I can see how this would simply be the original xenomorph that all the others sprung out from. However, rather than making the planet stuff like LV-46, we need to have a ship crash on a different planet. So rather than having a queen, we need to have some backwards, long-winded explanation instead of a simple one.
Watch me. I'll do the fingering.
I think this film does that a lot, and they really over-convoluted it when it would have been so easy to just keep things simple. Like it's right there, mate. Queen. Ship crashing? That's where the eggs and aliens end up. Why does it need to be a different planet? Whew. Nearly got me on a rant there, which I promised myself I wouldn't do. As we know from the other films though, the xenomorphs regarded as the perfect organism. So you can see how to the engineers, this would be the ultimate end goal. They made this lab to create something perfect, but in the end it backfired. I see it working really well as a metaphor for how we marvel at creating AI, but ultimately David turns against us. They brought on their own destruction, and it's a sort of cautionary tale when it comes to creating life. Now David examines the vials and sees the goo moving on top. This is one of the first references to John Hurt sticking his face in the egg, which is later mirrored in Milburn and Fifield. Shaw also shines her flashlight around and the mural starts to change. Outside, we can also see a storm forming. Now, they don't spell this out in the film, but this is actually a booby trap. Similar to the pyramids, the secrets were guarded, with the storms being used to stop the goo getting into the wrong hands. Knowing they need to go, Holloway shouts,
David, we are leaving!
Which is a nod to this bit from Aliens.
Rick, we are leaving!
Making a mad dash to the ship, we see how it becomes like the wrath of God. Reminds me of a swarm of locusts, with the stones getting kicked up from it appearing like insects. Shaw gets swept up in the storm because she's dead set on grabbing the engineer head. Seeing it laid out, I definitely got a lot of Lovecraft vibes from the scene. Stuart Now Playing brought up how similar the plot was to at the Mountains of Madness, and to be fair, there's a lot of similarities. In case you don't know, it basically involves a science expedition to the Antarctic. The crew discover ancient paintings and murals, and also the existence of elder gods. Getting answers to their questions slowly drives them insane, and they discover things about humanity they never knew. In the book, we also get the Shoggoth, and I feel like the helmet design was based around that. Guillermo del Toro was actually supposed to be adapting the work, but he ended up dropping out the project. It said he felt Prometheus was too similar to what his outline was, and that some scenes were almost identical. Now, saying that, I don't necessarily think Scott took the story. Instead, I'm of the mind that you might see shared amongst the fandom that this was done to decanonize Alien vs Predator. Scott hated it, and though it had elements of what was outlined for the creatures' backstories, he thought they got a lot of things wrong. However, both this and Prometheus feature similar themes. They both have major expeditions, and clues that point out aliens had a hand in human civilization. There's two alien species that fight against each other, and both films end with a hybrid of a xenomorph and secondary alien. Wayland is an elderly CEO in both that goes on a journey for his own specific needs, and both movies lead to him being killed by an alien. Both feature a female lead who lost their father, and both want to stop the threat reaching Earth's civilization. Both characters also have to fight against a giant alien awakened from stasis, and so on and so forth. Obviously, you get your other visually similar scenes, like humans exploring dark tunnels with flashlights. That's more of a standard in these films, but yeah, I think it's more just Scott making his version of the alien origins. Reviving the head, this is also Shaw attempting to play God. It explodes and highlights the kind of horrific things that can happen when pursuing scientific goals. Catching David wearing the dream helmet talking to a pod, this is another clue that Wayland's on the ship. Addressing them as Sir, he obviously wouldn't do this for anyone else. Outside, Vickers also wants to know what he said, and it adds to there being something else going on. She also slams him against the wall and overall is pretty abusive. It's likely that she did this a lot as he's unable to fight back. However, over the years, you could see this as being a factor into why he rises up against his masters. Instructing David to try harder, he then experiments with the black goo.
Big things have small beginnings.
At the snooker table, Holloway mocks him and even quotes Pinocchio.
I almost forgot you're not a real boy, huh?
Detail out of love is that we also have a little artificial figure of a boy on the table. Throughout the scene, this slowly falls over and it could represent David's downfall. Reach! Anyway, that gives us one of my favourite lines from the film, which is Holloway saying, "Humans made AI simply because they could." David's reply just sums up how devastated he is and how his whole life's been a disappointment.
Can you imagine how disappointing it would be for you to hear the same thing from your creator?
Fassbender brings this eerily chilled and reserved performance that also just oozes a dignified anger. That's all I can really describe it as, but you can read so much into his reaction. Holloway then does a classic toast.
Here's mud in your eye, pal.
Now, the origin of this phrase is chalked up to a number of things. Some have said it originated from trenches in World War I when people toasted after, surviving another day or something. Others have said, though, that it originated from taverns in America. There it was said to show a successful harvest, and so on and so forth. However, there's some that believe it comes from the Bible. Jesus cured someone's blindness by rubbing mud in their eye, and thus this allowed them to see. Due to the film's allusions to religion, I do feel like that was probably Scott's intention. Either way, Holloway's goo's first noticed in his eye, so him saying that as he sips it could explain its manifestation there. Going back to Shaw's room, we get a great bit of subtle imagery. Holloway presents a rose that he pushes through a hologram, and he then stands inside of it and puts it to his chin. Corpses are sometimes placed in coffins with roses on their chests, and this hologram around him sort of creates that imagery. It foreshadows his death, but for now the pair end up sleeping together. This then creates a dark creature inside her, which makes it basically the old-fashioned way of the facehugger implanting a seed. This is mirrored in the Captain and Vickers, which according to the wiki was a redo of a scene from Alien. Initially, they had a scene with Dallas and Ripley that had the pair sleeping together. This was supposed to be emotionally sterile though, and meant to highlight the lack of actual romance between the pair. Ridley said that space travel could be long and isolating, and thus the crew engaged in casual sex to fulfill their basic needs. Scott never filmed it for the first film, but he felt here it would work well with Vickers. We also see Yannick as an accordion, which he says belonged to Stephen Stills. Later in the scene, he sings "Love the One You're With," which is a song by the artist. Obviously, but we're being thorough. From here, we then cut to Milburn and Fifield, who come across a pile of engineers. They say how it looks like something broke out of them, which you can understand. You figured that one out yourself, mate. Give yourself a pat on the back. Now, what else involves something sensual is the snake that goes down Milburn's throat. Yay! Hey, mate, creepy snake alien thing, yeah? Just keep calling it beautiful. Keep going, hey, beautiful, you're beautiful. Stick your face in it. Obviously, it looks like a you-know-what, and the series has lots of phallic and throat imagery. There's, of course, the xenomorph head, the xenomorph second mouth, the facehugger tubes, and even Ash tries to shove a rolled-up magazine down Ripley's throat. We also see a play on the acid blood as they try and cut it off, and this ends up mutating Fifield. Originally, the design of the creature he becomes was slightly different, with him appearing more like a xenomorph. His face also elongated, and it almost combined with the helmet. What it helps, though, is to create something akin to the iconic head shape, which, to me, this creature Fifield becomes, that was the better design. Again, though, they wanted to remove a lot of the connections to Alien, and ended up going with like a weird Frankenstein zombie that later arrives at the ship hunched over, with it having some Xeno qualities on the ground. Now this again was the scene that Scott ended up redoing from Alien, the deleted scene of Lambert's original deaths on YouTube, and it shows a xenomorph hunched over like this. This then unfolds before killing the character, but they cut it because it looked bad. So here was Scott's chance to do it better, but I do wish they kept the original design. Anyway, at the ship, David discovers what I believe is an armory that was likely prepped to wipe out humanity. As Yannick later says, they wouldn't make weapons of mass destruction on their doorstep. The vials are laid horizontal, and this makes them appear like bullets. We also have the exoskeletons standing in a passage, which riffs off how the humans had their own suits on the ship. It's here that David comes across a chamber that ends up being like the one from Alien. Unfortunately for the creative team though, all of Giger's blueprints had been lost, so the set designers had to reference photos in the original film to get it as close as they could. I think they did a fantastic job, and I really didn't notice the difference. Now in here he discovers egg-like buttons and also a star map. Activating a hologram, we see an engineer sit down and play a flute. This would later be played off in Covenant, where David does the fingering. Stepping onto the platform, we then see the star map. This was inspired by the painting A Philosopher Lecture on the Orrery. Selecting Earth as the target, this was then supposed to tell the audience what the true mission was. It also allows the film to kind of play off some of the third acts from the others. There's always been the worry of a threat getting to Earth, and that's something they do with the ship. Anyway, Shaw watches firsthand how the virus takes over Holloway. Vickers refuses to let him on board though, and she ends up using a flamethrower to kill him. Ripley wanted to quarantine the crew in Alien, and a flamethrower is also a staple of the series. Now going off the production notes, this was also supposed to be a little clue about Wayland. Vickers' motivations were supposed to be fueled by the fact that she was worried about her dad. He only has days left to live, and she was worried a disease getting on board could kill him. To be fair, he didn't have that long left to live either. Apparently Theron broke character were in the scene though, but they decided to keep the take in. In the build up to it, she was excited to do it because she'd get to wield a real flamethrower. However, on the day, it finally hit her. I'm setting a real stuntman on fire here, and she was obviously worried about it going wrong. So the shock on her face was genuine, as in the moment she felt it might have gone badly. On the ship, they then remove Shaw's cross and she's put into a scanner. Similar tech like this was used on Kane and Alien, and it also showed a foreign object. Ash was the one who kept it secret, and though David tells her it's abnormal, he wants to put her in cryosleep. This will allow him to take it back to Earth, which is something Burke wanted to do in Alien. Shaw ends up rushing to the med pod, which is where she performs a manual cesarean. To be honest with you, mate, when the movie came out, I was someone who was like, why is she able to do this if the pod's built for a man? However, we do see her override it and perform a manual procedure. I know that's another point of contention with the film, but it's simply done to remove a foreign object, which we see in all its gory. It's a really horrific surgery scene down to her having to yank out the umbilical cord herself. Stitched back up, she heads out and Fifield arrives and attacks. Killing one guy and smashing another's head like the like button, he runs rampant on the ship. He's eventually run over by a transport, which reminds me a lot of the moment in Aliens with the Xenomorph. On the ship, Shaw comes face to face with Wayland, and we get a scene that would put Tarantino off feet forever. Trying to warn him of what's going on, he taunts her by asking if she's lost her faith. Putting on Holloway's ring, she decides to journey out with Wayland. Holloway was obviously a skeptic, and wearing this ring, it has its symbolism that comes full circle at the end when she takes the cross back from David. But we're going out, cesarean recovery be damned. Visited by Yannick, he says he won't allow any of the goo to get back to Earth and pretty much ensures his sacrifice. With Wayland, we then watch as his suit's fixed up. You might notice Ford here is also part of this too. She was also going to sedate Shaw to put her in stasis, which was clearly being directed by David. Because of this, you can put two and two together and realize she was part of Wayland's secret mission. So I love how some of the characters we've followed have this duplicitous nature, and it works nicely as a mirror to Alien. There it was revealed Ash had the real mission working for the company, and there's the crew here who have that as well. Vickers kinda shows a dissent though, as she views him as disrupting the natural order of life. The old die and are replaced by the young, but he's trying to stop this. Rubbing her head against his hand, it's almost like someone kissing the ring of a king. This is rejected, and the pair depart and end with a pretty bitter goodbye.
Anything else?
No. Father. That's it.
This is then coupled with David, who says,
That being said, doesn't everyone want their parents dead?
Shaw is enraged by this though, and she says she didn't, and originally we were going to learn about her mother. We'd apparently find out she died giving birth to her, and thus the concept of birth's really traumatic for her. So that scene before gets way more gravity to it. Now, how her mother would have appeared in her dream at the start knowing this, I really don't know, but yeah, that's what was planned. Heading back out, I also love how Wayland questions whether it's okay to remove his helmet. David says the air is fine, but Shaw says how they don't know how Holloway got infected.
Wait, we still don't know how Holloway got infected. If it's in the air.
It's not.
How do you know that?
I just love how David doesn't answer, because obviously he knows he's the one who infected him. As they head in, the scan then reveals it's the Horseshoe ship, but it's too late to warn those inside. However, it's clear David knew beforehand due to exploring the ship.
What is this?
It's a cargo hold.
Though we said armory before, that's of course the correct term, but he held this back to manipulate the humans, which is a great little indication of his character. Waking up the engineer, we see they also suffer from the same hibernation sickness as the humans, showing how similar we are. As you mentioned though, the conversation doesn't go too well and everyone gets wiped out. In his dying breath, Wayland says there's nothing, and he dies disappointed. Just in the same way he created machines just because he could do it, he finds that mirrored in the engineers. Much like how we'd carelessly dump a computer, the engineers are now dumping their creation. But how does our computer feel when we do that? Well, it doesn't, at least that we know about, but maybe they share the same sad emptiness as Wayland does.
There's nothing. I know.
Now, the pair being shot by this, it just shows how similar that they are. Both got to meet their maker and both saw there wasn't really any meaning behind why they were created, which is very devastating. I actually think though that Wayland's death's pretty poignant, with David giving him a somber farewell.
Have a good journey, Mr. Wayland.
He actually seems more human than Vickers, who simply leaves the monitor saying that it's done. Anyway, as the pilot seat begins to prepare, we watch as Shaw makes a run for it. I know the film gets dinged a lot for her running with a cesarean, but to be fair, she does constantly keel over throughout all of these scenes. Your mileage is going to vary on it though, and yeah, I do get why some people don't like it. I don't know how much logic should have been brought to an Alien movie though, but to me, they do at least keep acknowledging it. Like, they constantly bring attention to it, and it isn't just ignored, to be fair, but yeah, it would hurt running like that, I imagine. I've not had a cesarean myself, so I don't know. As the ship begins to ascend though, Yannick, and who I'm going to refer to as the Greek choir, they decide to head to their deaths. They're pretty much just there for laughs, you know, rattling off what's happening in the movie, and basically, yeah, just the Greek choir, that's the best word for it, I think.
If you think this means the bet's off, you're wrong.
Why don't you play me on the other side?
To be honest though, seeing how easily the Horseshoe is destroyed, I'm not sure it would have been a threat to Earth. 2,000 years ago, yeah, definitely, but if Earth has ships like the Prometheus, I feel like they would have just got annihilated upon reaching the planet. Like one nuke, even one missile, it's over, you save the world. Anyway, the life raft's ejected and Vickers escapes in a pod. As the Prometheus heads towards the ship, you also see graphics saying impact imminent. These are based off the ones from Alien after Ripley initiated the self-destruct. Now, this impact causes the ship to crash, which makes it begin to roll. Another thing people hate is how they don't just run to the side, and this leads to Vickers being crushed. I think when you're panicking though, and just running for your life, you're not really going to have the logic kick in that you would if you were calm. So again, it might not work for you, which is totally understandable, but I'm kind of just like, it's part of the movie. Like, I have way bigger issues with the story than that. Either way, Shaw has a close brush with death, but she survives due to the landscape. Getting to the lifeboat, it's here that Shaw encounters her quote-unquote child. This is extremely squid-like in nature, with this being a design they originally wanted for the facehuggers. However, they felt the finger design was creepier, but I appreciate this callback for a prequel. Ambushed by the engineer, it's then her child saves her. Just happens to be a really messed up metaphor for the parental themes in the movie, and also the idea that you're creating monsters and creating something new. Originally though, the engineer was going to enter the room and notice the video on the wall. In the lead up to this moment, we can see footage of Shaw as a child playing violin next to a tree. It was implied that he was impressed by this and didn't realise humans had such grace. This would then make him question his choices, but the facehugger would have cut the moment short. Impregnated by a tube going down his throat, we finally get that imagery coming full circle. On the outside, the skies then begin to clear, which is almost like the heavens opening up. Saying she can't do this anymore, she then hears a disembodied voice. Now, though this is David, you can read into the symbolism here as being like a message from the heavens. I did feel like the head being like this could even be a nod to Orpheus, who I first learned about in Sandman. This was actually a figure from Greek myths who was beheaded, but he still remained alive. This was then carried and cared for, and I do feel like the presentation's similar. We also get this line,
Dr. Shaw, can you hear me?
Which is a subtle nod to this.
Ash, can you hear me?
In both scenes, we have a beheaded android talking things out with the movie's main lead, which is a nice callback. Retrieving her cross from his suit, the pair then decide to work together. He informs her there's other ships, and thus she needs him to leave the planet. Wanting to travel out to the engineer, Shaw is still dedicated to finding answers. She wants to know why they created us and then hated us, and obviously the plan was going to have the Jesus revealed down the line. This would have then enriched her faith and paid off the central theme of belief.
Because that's what I choose to believe.
But it's what I choose to believe.
We then end with Shaw taking off in a ship, leaving a voice log about how she's the last surviving member of the Prometheus. This of course played off Ripley's final notes in the first two films. The ride isn't over yet though, and we close out with the birth of an Ultramorph. The creature was based on a goblin shark, and I do hope we see it at some point in the future. Originally though, this would have had a much larger role and actually appear earlier in the movie. The plan was that it would hatch and follow Shaw and she'd have a final fight against it. The original ending also had her going back to the tunnels, at which point she'd discover a garden. This would be like the Garden of Eden and then playing to the title of Paradise. However, here we see the ship going into space and out to the engineer's home. Obviously though, we know Ridley would go in another direction with most of these plot threads being dropped. That includes Elizabeth Shaw, sadly, who basically got poochied off screen. Anyway, the sequel is of course more of an Alien film, and I think that this was kind of damaged by expectations. Everyone wanted a Xenomorph movie, but Prometheus just isn't that. Like, there are connections there, but they're very tenuous, and I think that harmed a lot of people's enjoyment. However, I actually think there's a lot to like here, even if the ideas are better than the execution. I feel like the complaints people have are valid, but it also doesn't mean the ideas explored here aren't at least interesting. I do wish that they'd left a lot of the deleted scenes though, as I really feel like they help improve the movie. Though Scott's often known for his director's cuts, he has said he's declined the studio's offer for this one. So instead, we just have the deleted scenes to piece this together, but hopefully this has given you a bit more of a full picture. The whole theme of the movie is creators coming back to kill their children, and that feels like it's almost what Scott's done. He didn't want to make an alien movie, and instead was creating a new mythology to spring something out from. Whether that works or not is up for debate, but obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please drop a like if you have, and if you got any other theories or stuff we missed or got wrong, yeah, we might have got stuff wrong, it's very open-ended, yeah, drop a comment below, as I'd love to read your corrections. Welcome to the Heavy Spoilers Show. I'm your host Paul, and in this video we're breaking down Prometheus 2. Now, so obviously, Alien Course Correction takes things back to the series' roots, and Covenant's always been a really weird movie, for me anyway. Releasing 5 years after Prometheus, it was a long time coming that felt afflicted by several factors. You can definitely feel the studio's hand here, and even Ridley Scott admitted he adjusted for feedback. I've even seen this film described as being like almost an apology to Prometheus. Their audiences expected a xenomorph horror, and instead we got a creationism study. Though I think the film goes into some great ideas, the general public didn't feel the same. Audiences often don't like being tricked, and to save the franchise they went back to basics. Instead of titling this so it ties in with Prometheus, they tell you straight away that this is Alien. However, over its lengthy development, they went back and forth over what to do. Now if you've seen our breakdown of Prometheus, then you'll know we discussed Paradise Lost. Paradise was even the title of the movie at one point, but Scott felt it gave too much away. However, that theme continued whenever Scott was discussing it. Covenant's original title was Paradise Lost, which he announced in 2015. Because if it's paradise, paradise cannot be what you think it is. Paradise has a connotation of being extremely sinister and ominous. Though this was changed in the end, quotes and nods to the poem are still found in the film.
Serve in heaven, or reign in hell.
So they steered towards that, and initially Planet 4 is seen as a paradise. All the other planets in the film are typically barren, and there's the idea they need to be terraformed. However, Planet 4 is ready to go, and thus this played into the title. Now though Scott stayed on, who didn't was Damon Lindelof. Saying he felt the sequel might benefit from a fresh take, he decided to step away from the series. Lindelof is known for not really providing answers, and thus they went back to the drawing board for the script. Having suspected he wouldn't return, Fox had actually already approached other writers. Now the original idea was to take focus on Shaw and have her journey to the planet. David would then learn to further hate the humans, and he already hated the engineers. Eventually he'd rise up above both and become the big threat in the galaxy. However, an extensive overhaul was then provided by Gladiator's John Logan. Crafting two stories that intertwined, this would mix Alien with Prometheus. So yeah, that was Paradise Lost, in which the crew would see their paradise lost. The film would also follow the poem's basic structure along with all its themes. I don't want to just repeat the last video, but David would be seen as a Luciferian figure who faced banishment on this planet due to standing up to God. That to the characters is of course the engineers, which David wipes out in a flashback. Just a side tangent as well, they might not actually be engineers, but we'll address that later in the video. Anyway, we would also have the Adam and Eve parallels with the new characters of Daniels and Walter. David would act as a snake that tempts them in the Garden of Eden, and then David and Daniels would leave the planet after David tricks the pair. Now Scott stated early on after Prometheus that this movie wouldn't feature any xenomorphs. Instead, he said it would be humans versus AI. So Logan ended up providing the xenomorphs, but from what I can gather, the story followed the same beats through most of the drafts. Scott then announced there would be 4 prequels in his run, with this of course being the second. Scott said the original idea was that AI had evolved to the point it could create life, thus it had grown beyond us and there was no need for us to exist anymore. This would then lead to Alien Awakening before then going into a final film. This would bridge the then roughly 30-year gap between Prometheus and Alien. So he teased that the xenomorphs would come eventually, but yeah, I'm guessing his hand was forced. Now, I don't think we're ever going to get that, as the guy's like 87 at the time of making this video, and obviously they've started a new direction with Romulus. However, there was a time when the studio were all in on his plan. This even came at the cost of Alien 5, which was going to be led by Neil Blomkamp. That was basically going to Halloween the franchise and wipe out the sequels of 3 and Resurrection. Both Sigourney Weaver and Michael Biehn were on board, and Scott was producing the movie. Though it was due to release in 2017, the project was delayed to give Covenant room to breathe. Then after numerous delays, the project was unfortunately cancelled. Blomkamp said in 2021 he felt like Scott had lost interest in him doing it. He said that he felt the negative reception to Chappie likely led to this happening. Due to this, he said the directors not doing any pre-existing IPs because both this and Halo went nowhere. Beyond that though, Fox execs actually talked about the project last year. They said Alien 5 was going to be like District 9, and not in a good way. Feeling Scott was the father of the franchise, they instead decided to bet on him first. After Covenant disappointed, they then scrapped Alien 5 and felt like they needed to rethink things. Like, even if you go back to Romulus, you know, that was initially going to be just a streaming movie, and they saw how good it was and decided to put it out in theaters. So it's clear that they didn't really have any idea of what they were doing, and come Disney's acquisition of Fox, things got completely cleaned off the board. So that's why things changed, and again, yeah, I doubt we're getting those 2 other prequels. Now it's clear they cut out a lot of the movie and whittled it right down to a simple structure. The original runtime was 2 hours 23, with 20 minutes being cut from the final run. Scott based his edits on screen tests and moments he felt dragged the pacing. However, we did get 2 scenes released in the build up to this, with the prologues being up on YouTube. Now, the first of these features Elizabeth Shaw, who's once more rejoined by David. Narrating the journey, he describes the compassion that Elizabeth showed him. Having never experienced this with Wayland, she put him back together and made him whole. David then used the ship to locate the engineer's home, and he put Shaw down for the long nap. Left alone on the ship once more, this would then reflect his time on the Prometheus. It would then also come full circle at the end when we see him putting Daniels to sleep. He'd be on the ship, and both instances would lead to something horrible. These would be what he did to Shaw and also the engineers on the planet. Asterisks there on engineers. He obviously arrived and wiped them out, which would then lead into his time on the planet. Experimenting on Shaw, he'd repay her kindness by making her something new. Thank you. If you cast your mind back to Prometheus though, you might remember how Shaw couldn't get pregnant. Because of this, she saw herself as being unable to create life, and thus she felt she was less than. However, she ended up giving birth, and in this film, David uses her ovaries to create the eggs. This makes Shaw and David the mother and father of the xenomorphs, and thus it's a twisted version of Adam and Eve. It all springs out from this prologue in which he puts her to sleep on the ship. So Daniels being left alone at the end of the movie, it would obviously have much more horror if they had have included this in the opening, which I think they should have done. It's one of the scenes that I think should have remained, as it just builds things better better off the last movie. Noomi Rapace returning and not just getting poochied, you know, it just acts a little better. Also, I realised when writing this, they did the same thing with Newton Hicks and killed him off screen, which was always disappointing, so why have you done it again? I think including it as well, you'd also have her fate being left up in the air for the first 50 minutes, and we'd be wondering what happened to the character. So yeah, I think it should have stayed, and I'd recommend anybody watch that before watching the movie. That's also the case with the second prologue scene, titled Last Supper. The religious illusions begin here. It's another scene I think they should have kept in the movie, as it really helps us to get to know the crew. I know you can just look at these on YouTube, but to me, at least, you need to have this stuff in the actual movie. Anyway, we join the crew of the Covenant before they take their naps and we get to know the characters. It's the camaraderie that Scott's known for, with it very much feeling like the crew scenes from Alien. There the group had their Last Supper as the Xenomorph arrived, and here it's sort of the same thing. We even get a nod to the Last Supper later when we see a picture of the crew that was taken right before this prologue. Who we actually get to see in a scene properly though is James Franco, who plays Daniel's husband. He dies at the start of the movie, and I know a lot of people didn't even know he was in the movie. The character's ill, so he goes to bed early, but he does a line that foreshadows his fate.
I'm just burning up.
Which, yeah, because his pod sets on fire. That's foreshadowing, kids. Danny McBride's Tennessee also asks who's going to toast, and Orm opens his mouth to speak up. However, the captain says Daniels and basically shuts down the character. Now, Orm's overlooked throughout the movie, and he's mocked because he's a man of religion. It really ties into the themes of the film and also the title of the ship. A covenant seen as a contract and something that ties people together. We learn the ship's made up entirely of married couples, and thus it applies to that. However, a covenant can also be seen as something between man and God. That contract in the series started with the engineers and man, in which they created us and then gave us Jesus. However, we broke that contract and crucified him, and thus they set out for revenge. On the flip side of this, the humans then made machines, and there was a contract they wouldn't hurt us. Pretty much every movie that discusses AI, they always go over the rules that are kind of built into their systems. Things like iRobot, The Matrix, and so forth. They all have rules that prohibit machines from harming man. However, you could see David as breaking that contract, and thus he's turned on his masters. There's also the Mayflower Covenant, which was a contract signed by the Pilgrims upon reaching America. These guys are obviously discovering a new world, and I really like how that title kind of plays into the themes of the film. It also clearly builds upon the fears laid out in Prometheus. The androids are like the disobedient child that the engineers saw humanity as being. This all ties into the myth where Prometheus gave fire to the mortals. The gods were worried we'd then overthrow them, and thus Prometheus was punished. We have the same thing with the engineers who worried about us after seeing what we did to Jesus. Now we have the humans worrying about AI, so it's sort of like poetry, they rhyme. There's even the theories that the engineers were created by someone they overthrew, and we may have this cycle in constant repetition. Beyond that though, the religious illusions are laced throughout. The Now Playing podcast discussed why Orm's seen as an outcast, and when you think about it, the premise makes a lot of sense. These are all people of science heading out to form a new planet. Say the humans get cut off from humanity, this planet will house an ignorant society. Ignorance probably the wrong word there, but thousands of years from now, the humans on the planet, they may not know how they even ended up here. Information can of course be lost over time, and the inhabitants there might even create their own religion. I know there's people who also believe that humans originally didn't come from Earth. The theory is that we came from another planet and then we were dropped here and lost that connection. So that could be very much what we're seeing the beginning of here. Now, because of that, you could see why the crew are cynical to religion. Just in the same way David found his creators in humanity disappointing, the engineers were a disappointing reveal for what created us. I don't just mean in the movie either. It was all just about them messing about and seeing what they could create, rather than there being a grand goal or plan. So potentially the crew here might even be aware of that, and thus they're skeptical of religion. I don't really think this movie debunks religion at all, and humans could still hold the same beliefs while going into space. However, you can see how that might wane in some people. Still though, the religious illusions are strong. The Xenomorph later on stands up in a crucifixion pose, and in David's lab we also have a protomorph strung out on a cross. Daniels even wears a nail around her neck. Though this is the first nail she wants to put into her cabin, you could see it as symbolism for the nail that crucified Jesus. Jesus gets a direct nod as well, as we see this painting at the beginning.
The Nativity by Piero della Francesca.
The plot in itself was an attempt to turn mankind into a Type 2 civilization which would save us from extinction. The creative team said they looked at Noah's Ark and placed the Earth as being civilization and space like the oceans that flooded it. The Covenant was the Ark that would allow them to survive and begin something new. We'll talk about these boat similarities later on, but the patch that the crew members wear also has two angels crouching and facing each other. This is supposed to riff off the two angels that are said to be on the Ark of the Covenant. The SOS was originally supposed to be a prayer. However, they thought that was too on the nose, and thus they changed it to Country Road, take me home to the place. However, it shows they originally wanted to hammer home the religious idea, and thus it was interwoven in the plot. We also have Upworth choking around the table, which is supposed to mimic the chestburster moment. Walter just smacks her back like the like button though, and thus the food's freed. Around the time, there was the rumour that the film had a throat burster, and fans suspected this was foreshadowing it. There are even comments on the video that talk about how it could be her, but I think things got lost in the leaks. If you follow this channel for a while, then you'll know plot leaks normally have discrepancies. It's just a theory, but I think the neomorph that burst out of Hallett's mouth probably got spoiled and fans just assumed it was a throat burster. What this movie does is also continue the tradition of having a different group of people facing the xenomorphs. This is something that Scott brought up when talking about making the movie, and they realized they had to do something different. Alien had the space truckers, Aliens had the Marines, and Alien 3 had the prisoners. Alien Resurrection then had smugglers, and Prometheus was scientists. Allegedly, they were pretty stupid. Covenant's made up of pioneers, and it is nice seeing how different groups react. Now, one thing I thought when leaving this movie is that all of the characters, bar none, they're all idiots as well. Like, absolute room temperature IQ, screen crush viewer, hit the thumbs up on Ryan Airy video type morons. However, in doing my research, I found there's actually a reason for that. In the Alien Covenant Origins novel, it outlines why the colonists weren't the sharpest tools in the shed. Loeb basically feared his role being challenged once they got to the planet. He was to have the planetary head of security role, which was a very coveted position. This would basically put him in charge of everything, and thus he didn't want to be challenged. So they hired people who were neither that smart or good when it came to combat. Obviously, I always think stuff like that should be in the movie itself because I hate how stupid they are, and it would have made my problems lessen a lot, originally anyway. Scott has a habit of making people watch deleted scenes and read supplementary material to get stuff, and hopefully, if you have issues with it too, then that's at least made it a little better. But I still think they're idiots, and I can't sanction their buffoonery. Now, for the rest of the video, we'll be breaking the movie down scene by scene, but firstly, just a quick word from our sponsors.
There's so much here that doesn't make sense.
Yep, you can say that again. A huge shout out to our partners at Arrow Video who sell a ton of 4K Blu-rays on some really classic titles. They've got movies like The Great Escape, Silence of the Lambs, Candyman, RoboCop, and a lot more. For 10% off, click my link in the description and use the code HEAVYSPOILERS. That's 10% off in my link in the description with the code HEAVYSPOILERS. You deserve it, mate. Treat yourself. Now we start with the 20th Century Fox logo, which is filtered to have the Prometheus blue. The ties to that movie are seen right from the off as we join David and Wayland. At this point in time he runs the company, but we know from Covenant's badge that Yutanis purchased it. This was done after the character's death, and they just kept the Wayland name for name recognition. Now in what's one of the many Blade Runner parallels, we open with a shot of an eye. That's what kicked off both the original film and also 2049, which Scott produced and released the same year as this. This shot was originally used because eyes were the windows to the soul. Blade Runner often questioned if the replicants had one, and it's something you can ask about David. Thematically, David is akin to the replicants, and they even based elements of his look on Roy Batty. Batty gets several nods in the movie, and this starts off when he stabs Walter. Before doing this, David kisses him, and Batty kissed Tyrell before he then killed him. This is then built upon in the David and Daniels fight. Daniels stabs a nail through his chin and he says,
"That's the spirit."
In Blade Runner, Batty stabs his hand with a nail and then says to Deckard,
That's the spirit!
David also asks Walter if he dreams, and this question was asked during Blade Runner. That movie was of course based on Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which also plays into that idea. Speaking of dreams, throughout the film we see the crew in their sleep suits. These are unlike the ones from the other films, with them being white bodysuits and headpieces. This is new for the franchise, but it's actually another nod to Blade Runner. If you're scratching your head over that, it's because they only appeared in a deleted scene. You see me acting that out? That's effort for you there, guys. guys. And this deleted scene involved Deckard visiting a hospital where he went to see Holden recovering. Holden was in a similar stasis chamber and also wearing a white suit like this. This is something we see more of at the end when David walks through the passenger bay. Here we can catch the population sleeping, and you might notice one of the names. The first person we see on the top left has the name Deckard, which is of course a nod to Deckard from Blade Runner. Blade Runner's entire premise was whether the replicants were alive, and the first thing Weyland asks is this:
How do you feel?
To which David responds,
Alive.
Saying he feels alive highlights the true nature of the character, and though he's synthetic, to me, he still has that side of him that's alive. Doing his best AI image recognition, he then looks around the room. Weyland then says this:
I am your father.
Though a father can be a parent, it's also a name used to describe God. It's at this point that we then see Michelangelo's David, which of course provides the character his name. That David scene is a masterpiece due to the craftsmanship that was required. It's often noted as the peak of the High Renaissance, and at the time it stood as a powerful symbol of Florence. This is something that's been used before in Scott's films, with it also appearing at the beginning of Hannibal. David was also used as the basis for the look of the engineers. They wanted to make them appear like marble statues, and you can definitely see this in their look. This comes full circle in David's lab later as we see a flayed engineer propped up to stand like the statue of David. So we have these two replicas of men that represent different points of the height of civilization. A detail I love is that we get Fassbender's name appear on screen as a credit, and it fades away, leaving behind the letters AI. Now, though David's one of a kind at this point, we later see how he's become commercialized. Walter's a copy of the character, though he is seen as an upgrade. However, they wanted to play up this idea of him being a more commercial product in the accents. Not only would Walter having an American one show he was more of a commercial product, but it would also help to distinguish the characters. Beyond that though, it sort of plays off the franchise itself. Ash had a British voice in the first film, and his true nature as a company man was kept secret. He was used for highly secretive missions, and thus they had a British accent to denote his security. Bishop then appeared in the sequel with an American accent, as he was more of a commercial version used widely across the field. Things were further played upon these lines later down the line in Romulus, where we had Andy switch accents depending on his loyalties. Whenever he was working on the company's mission, he spoke with a British one. Though that was part of Ash's chip, I think Scott clearly makes these choices for a reason due to how often it happens. David has just been switched on, and here he comes face to face with his creator, so he's already ahead of us in terms of knowing the answers to where he came from. Beyond this, he'll also not die, which is one of the things that's pushing Weyland, facing his own mortality that drives his actions throughout Prometheus. It's also nice just seeing Guy Pearce not covered in terrible old age makeup. However, they did add some, but they did it in more subtle ways to show he was grappling with his mortality. Now Weyland asks David to choose a piece of music. David chooses Wagner's Das Rheingold, Entry of the Gods into Valhalla. This actually plays into the plot really nicely, and the story of it reflects David's arc. The opera is about a dwarf called Alberic who destroys his chance at love in order to create the ultimate weapon. This is a ring which grants the user the ultimate power. Whoever possesses it's near unstoppable, however it comes with a cost. Whoever has it refuses to give it up, and whoever doesn't wants it for their own. Thus it caused the downfall of the gods, and it's influenced lots of things like Lord of the Rings, which I'm sure you can guess. How it applies to this story though is that David forsakes his bond with Shaw in order to experiment on the black goo. In doing this, he destroys the engineers as well, who are the gods in this franchise. Whereas Alberic created the perfect weapon, David engineers the xenomorphs, who are seen as the perfect organism. The comparisons go way beyond this, as the ring was also cursed by Alberic. All who sought after it faced their death and destruction. This parallels Whale and Yutani, who are constantly attempting to gain the xenomorphs for their own weapons department, even though it always leads to doom. Like, stop doing it. So it's a great piece that of course comes full circle at the end, where he heads out to experiment on the passengers. Here he'll forge the xenomorphs, and thus it works really well with the film's subtext. Now, in our other alien breakdowns, we talked about how the android names ascended up the alphabet throughout the series. There was Ash, Bishop, Call, and then David. However, this breaks it and we get Walter. Walter was actually named after producer Walter Hill, and though I like you, mate, you ruined my best Easter egg. Ruined it! Weyland then rattles off about how all these items are meaningless in the face of where we come from. We poignantly end with the feeling that AI will surpass man, and though they serve us, it won't be for long.
Bring me this tea, David.
Bring me the tea.
It's a menial thing to do, but it exemplifies how Wayland exerts control. The tea's right beside him, and David has to walk all the way over, but he still has him do it because it showcases power. Wayland created David in his vanity, but one of David's first thoughts is how he's better than those he's serving. So this seed of dissent's what drives him, as he knows the humans aren't better, even though they act like it. However, paying attention to Wayland, he's clearly looking at David with jealousy. To me, it plays off the scene in Prometheus where Wayland said David didn't have a soul. We saw that same frustration in him, and it's a great way to bring things full circle. To me, the prologue with Shaw, it's all way more interesting than where we go to next. That is the Covenant on December 5th, 2104. Prometheus was also set in December, with the majority going down on Christmas. So I did wonder if they'd try a similar thing here, but they don't really go with it. What we do get a connection to from the past though is the score by Jerry Goldsmith. This is the first time it's been used since the original Alien, with Scott wanting to give us more of the themes from that. In what's another mirror of Prometheus, we then cut to Walter walking around the ship. He's providing maintenance, and we see him unlock the solar sails. Always reminded me of Count Dooku's ship in Attack of the Clones, and yeah, really cool design. Now, just in the same way that David tapped into Shaw's dreams last time, we see Walter overlooking the crew. We then get Mother say,
7 bells and all's well.
According to IMDb trivia, this is a naval saying that comes from when the majority of sailors couldn't afford watches or even tell the time. The bells will be used to correspond to the hour and will be set off by an hourglass. This would allow a crew to tell the time and also mark how far they went into the journey. So 7 bells and all's well would mark the time and let them know things were operating normally. Now, though things seem okay, we see that one of the embryos is broken. David later places in some face huggers, and it's a creepy detail that's always stuck with me. Kind of foreshadowing the doom they're in, and yeah, though they're saying 7 bells and all's well, something's gonna be a bit off here. To make matters worse, the ship's then struck by a neutrino burst. I love the way this appears like a wave, and it further ties into the sea metaphors with the sails and bells. Causing a critical emergency, the crew are woken up with Daniels waking up to a nightmare. This comes full circle at the end when she goes to sleep, and a new nightmare begins. Which you should have checked it was Walter before you went down, you idiot. But I'll let you off because they've explained that there's a reason why you're an idiot. Now we also have Carmen and Jojo as Kareen, who we see being sick. This just kind of builds off the hypersleep hangover people get, which has been in most of the movies. As Walter puts out the fire, we also see the X-like warning signals that first appeared during Alien. Now Daniels isn't exactly having a good day, and we see as her husband's cooked alive. How we know this is because if you look at his pod, you'll see he still has a heartbeat. Moving to a video of a peaceful forest walk, this is one of our many callbacks to Ripley. During Aliens, there was a deleted scene which is on the director's cut that shows Ripley in front of a similar backdrop. There she learned that she lost her daughter, whereas for Daniels it's of course her husband. We also have her basic character design as well. Daniels is basically a Ripley stand-in from Aliens, with her having a very similar haircut. When doing my research though, I found out that Catherine Waterston actually used this as a part of her audition tape that she made on Fantastic Beasts. When she was inside Ezra Miller's trailer, she noticed the wig he was using with Credence. Trying it on, she then filmed the tape while rocking that phenomenal wig. We also see a video of Franco climbing, and yeah, after seeing 127 hours, mate, you want to be careful. Now in his death, Orum's now in charge. I found it hilarious how he's like constantly going on about religion, but when it comes to whether to give the captain a service, he just says skip it. This was your one chance to do it. Now we also have Jusei Smouye. There was a deleted scene where 2 xenomorphs beat him outside, but it took... Oh, right, skip that. Ooh, anyway, Walter blames bad luck for the flare and says there's no way to predict these kind of events. However, Oram doesn't believe in bad luck, and I feel like he sees the planet as divine intervention.
Oh, ye of little faith.
Realizing the need to fix the ship, we then meet the rest of the crew. Behind Tennessee, we can also spot a screen with moving rectangles, which is akin to the landing display from the first Alien. Personally, I felt they should have just skipped the whole fixing the ship thing and instead just kept in the prologue scenes. Like, seeing the ship get fixed isn't really crucial to the plot, and I feel like the film really suffers in the editing. It's sporadic at points and doesn't really give us the information we need to know in a concise way. Instead, we focus on really stupid things while important stuff's glossed over. It's like 45 minutes before we even get to an action scene, and yeah, just cut the ship fixing down, mate. It looks Looks good, I'll admit that, it looks very good, but yeah, if it's at the cost of the prologues, I know what you should keep. Still though, we get to explore the ship and also go back to the hangar bay. We see a JCB and also the evolution of the ground vehicle from last time. Later on, we get an Audi Luna Quattro, which is a piece of real-world tech. Built by Audi, this was designed to explore other planets and moons and surfaces on Earth that were difficult for humans to get to. So its inclusion's a really nice touch. Now Daniels tells Walter about the cabin, which obviously gives David away later. The pair also hold service against Orum's wishes and they eject the captain into space. This sees his body wrapped in white linen, which riffs off the service given to Kane during Alien. Correcting the sails, Tennessee then picks up a mysterious signal. As we know, this is John Denver's Take Me Home Country Roads, which is sung by Elizabeth Shaw. Now obviously she thought the engineer planet was the cradle where our species was created, so it makes sense she'd see that as going home. However, there's also a reason why David put that recording into the universe. It's a welcoming song that will make people want to go investigate. Just like the call of the siren, it's drawing these sailors to doom. David is using this as a lure so he can get not only people to experiment on, but also to escape the planet. Beyond that, the song also has religious allusions. It comes from the album Poems, Prayers and Promises and is about the optimism the crew now have. Though they're heading to Origay 6, it would likely have to be terraformed. As we've seen in the other movies, this is a miserable time to be on the world. It takes decades and the inhabitants dwell in darkness. However, Planet 4 is already habitable, so it just makes sense to go there. It's also evaded discovery and it doesn't have an LV designation. LV stands for Life Viable and the company weren't aware of it. Shout out to Twin Perfect, who also said they may not have been able to scan it due to the electrical storms that we see surrounding it. Later on, this cuts off communication between them and the ship, so it does make sense.
I'm not sure they'll hear you through the storm.
Oram sees this as a potential sign from God and we watch as the crew head to the planet. Noah wants to get back into the pods, and as Oram says,
I'm not free climbing here.
Daniels has just watched a video of her husband doing this, and though she doesn't fully bite her tongue, she doesn't protest as much. So they're lured in by the signals, with something like this also drawing the crew in an Alien. Entering the atmosphere, we further see how difficult it would be to actually land on a planet. In our Alien breakdown, we discussed how scientists applauded Scott due to how realistically he depicted it. They said it wouldn't be like Star Wars where you just like parking a car. Instead, it's difficult, filled with storms, and yeah, I appreciate he carried it across. Anyway, they head out in the lander, which also builds off the one in Prometheus. Discovering wheat, they then come across a crash site. This leads them to the Juggernaut ship which David arrived in. Now, though it seemed like David just arrived and killed everyone, it's possible the planet fought back. When the crew take off later, we can see the docking claw crashed in the forest. Because of this, it's believed the docking claw fought back, and then the tussle caused both that and the Juggernaut to crash. So at this point, Daniels also says there's no birds or life on the planet. Upon arriving with the black goo, David wiped everything out. We then see as Ledward goes for a smoke. He ends up becoming the first infected, and this was done to mirror Kane. Both were smokers in their respective films, and both were the first to be killed. He then steps on the egg sacs, which were designed to look like Lysoperdon pyriform puffball fungi, which I got in one. Blowing the smoke makes the spores start to collect and then begin to swarm. Scott said they studied bees for their movement, and bees have influenced the series throughout. We of course have the queen, and the xenomorphs collect in a hive like nest. Now the idea of xenomorphs being able to spread through airborne means that actually came from William Gibson's unproduced Alien 3 script. Now one thing I don't really like with the spores is how fast they operate. I think due to the speed, you never really get that build-up of tension because it just happens so fast. Like a facehugger is much more scary, you know what I mean? I also never understood why having to go through the whole egg, then facehugger, then chestburster, etc, etc. I never understood how that was seen as being more perfect than this, but here we are. I do think this movie has an oversized cast as well, and they kind of needed to basically use them all as red shirts. So at the 37-minute mark, they start setting things up and eventually just rip through the characters. Now another detail that's important to note is that the spores gestate in different parts of the body. For example, Ledward's spores go into his ears and your ears connect to your spine. When Tom comes across the spores, he sniffs them and the creature then bursts out of his mouth. That happens when they come across the Juggernaut, which we then see them them exploring, walking down the corridors with flashlights. This is iconography that's appeared in most of the movies. Daniels also comes across Shaw's dog tags. This confirms that she's been dead long before we actually get the reveal. We also have the photo of her and Holloway and discover their disappearance is legendary. It's sort of an unsolved mystery, and in the cockpit they come across the message. However, Ledward's infection strikes up, and this is mirrored in Tom. Faris worried about quarantine protocols, and this is an issue Ripley had as well. Should have just all worn helmets, mate. Alien planet, yeah? You just wear helmets. Now it's at this point we get the birth of the neomorph that comes out of Ledward's back. It's gory as hell, and yeah, something to remember about the movie. It of course builds off the chestburster, and did you know, on merch store below, we've got some chestburster shirts right there. It's one of our most popular shirts, and it's perfect for Alien fans just like you. You like watching a 50-minute long Alien breakdown, mate? You'll love this, mate. Good job. Now in crafting the neomorph, they also looked at goblin sharks, which we see in their mouths later on. Even as a baby, it causes complete havoc, because everyone's an idiot and tripping up when fighting. Like Faris misses and blows up the entire ship. Proper idiot who couldn't have hit the thumbs up button on a great breakdown. Now, though I'm ragging on the movie, I really love the shots in the long grass with the green lasers. Ridley always nails the look of things, and some of the shots are fantastic. They rip apart the red shirts, and then David has to come in and save them. It reminded me a lot of Obi-Wan in A New Hope, especially due to the hood and cape. Also, kinda got vibes of Predator when Lawrence Fishburne showed up and saved the day. Now, though we see cloaks these days and think of the friendly Jedi, in the past, they were used in fiction to denote villains. The devil, vampires, they'd all be figures who would wear them. Even in Return of the Jedi, when Luke showed up rocking a black one, there was supposed to be the feeling that he might have gone bad. So it plays upon those ideals and lets us know we shouldn't trust him. He then takes them to the city, which is clearly ripping off Pompeii. There, people were frozen like statues due to how fast they were hit by the volcano Mount Vesuvius. Though we don't know what happened here, it's clear something quickly caught them off guard and wiped them all out. Heading inside, we also see gigantic heads carved out of stone, which riffs off the ones found in Prometheus. Explaining what happened, I love how inquisitive David is about the colonists.
How many colonists?
Over 2,000.
Well. So many good souls.
Just the way he kind of says, so many good souls, and his face lights up there knowing he'll have 2,000 people to experiment on. So far he's only had Shaw, but this means he can perfect his experiments. We then get David in his room and he sings,
"But the man who broke the bank in Monte Carlo."
According to IMDb trivia, this is actually another nod to Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence wandered in the desert by himself for several days, and in his delirium he sang to hear the echoes.
I'm the man who broke the bank at Monte Carlo.
He then came into contact with a British officer and was saved from doom and loneliness. From this point on, he became far colder and eventually goes to a no prisoner mind state in his military operations. So it's very much a turning point for the character that we also see in David. Framed in a distorted mirror, this highlights how he's a skewed version of what he was. What he's supposed to be is reflected in Walter, and we then see as the pair discuss some fingering. Not like that.
Whistle and I'll come.
Bit funny this scene, but that quote comes from "Oh whistle and I'll come to you, my lad." Written by M.R. James, this involved a whistle that released an evil spirit upon being blown into. So you can see how that would apply to David and also the creatures. We also see drawings on the walls with these mimicking the engineers and xenomorphs.
I'll do the fingering.
Do you even listen to yourself when you talk?
It's very homoerotic because you've got him blowing into a flute and talking about fingering, but Scott said this was on purpose. He based it off the pottery scene from Ghost and wanted to show a connection between the pair. Either way, I will say that the compositing's really good, and we see the camera pan back and forth between the pair flawlessly. There's no seams, and you could easily convince someone it was twins or something. Now Walter plays it perfectly, and David applauds it. However, Walter reveals that the models are no longer allowed to create. Due to David, they've since been restricted because he creeped people out.
They don't like you, I don't like you.
It further plays into the Prometheus themes and how the gods were worried about the humans using fire against them. Humanity has now restricted AI, and the machines are, well,
more like machines.
Now we then see them going to the balcony overlooking the city. As we step out, we get a wide shot of the location and can see it's surrounded by trees. This is a nod to Isle of the Dead, which was by artist Arnold Böcklin. David also says,
"My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
Now there's a couple of clues within this that there's something off about David. Firstly, the android takes its meaning as it being about building something that will last for eternity. David is immortal and he believes he'll build a covenant with the xenomorphs. This sort of, for lack of a better word, marriage will last forever and they'll create perfect children. However, the poem is actually about how all things eventually die and decay. The poem is basically about a destroyed statue that has the quote at the base of it. The statue is for Ramses II, who was one of the longest reigning pharaohs. Even though he had a vast and expansive empire at one point, all that remained now was this destroyed statue. David also attributes the poem to Lord Byron, even though it was written by Shelley.
Byron. Shelley.
Are you saying I'm stupid?
This was put in place to highlight how his knowledge systems become corrupted and it's starting to decay. Being away from humanity for 10 years means he hasn't been maintained and thus his logic's running into issues.
When one note is off, it eventually destroys the whole symphony, David.
While this is going on, we also see what really happened when he came to the planet. Now though he says,
"We were able to activate their ship and set course for their homeworld."
it's actually believed that these aren't engineers per se. Putting them side by side with the ones in Prometheus, we can see there's lots of differences in their face. Their skin isn't as white and they have more human-like eyes. They also greet the ship's arrival in a way that's quite strange and seem more like they're seeing them after not seeing them for a long time, which to be fair, it's been 2,000 years at least. Because of this though, it's thought that these might in fact be another form of life created by the engineers. Now in Prometheus, they discussed how he shared a lot of the same DNA. It's thought that these creatures are the same, and just like humanity, they're also some of their offspring. The cave paintings in Prometheus, they also highlighted they had a hand in human history. Because of this welcome, it's thought that the inhabitants were basically the better versions of humans, and they were still on good terms with the engineers. So when they arrived, they were happy to see them because they thought it was their creators coming to interact with their culture again. They seem very primitive apart from the docking claw, which may have also been left by the engineers for their return. They may have even created them after they created us and steered them towards being more like them, which makes a lot of sense I think. David then unleashes the black goo canisters, and I love how they form strands of DNA before hitting the surface. It also looks like ash spreading through the air, which again riffs off Pompeii. We then see Shaw's token grave. As we know though, she's been experimented on, even though David says that he loved her. He says that no human ever showed him compassion like that, so you might wonder why he did what he did. However, I think in David's twisted logic, it was just part of life. In Prometheus, he said to Shaw how it's every child's dream to kill their parents, which is pretty much what he's done. When we eventually see her corpse, she's clearly been mutated.
It doesn't look that bad, Patty. Leaping lassies! What did they do to you?
It's possible that she was even the first alien queen, and from her came forth the eggs. David doesn't have anything else organic on the planet, and thus it makes sense those eggs in the basement probably belong to her. Her design was also based off the work of H.R. Giger, namely his painting Lie 1. Now, while this is going on, we see the Neomorph arriving and Rosenthal getting washed. There's water dripping in the background, and she turns around to see the Neomorph.
How you doing?
This was done to mimic the death of Brett and Alien, with the scenes being set up similarly. David then comes across the creature, and we see the two interacting calmly. This introduces the element the Xenomorphs could even be tamed, and they likely just react to fear. Breathing on it's thought to be a bond similar to one that you can get with a horse. However, Oram then kills it, which leads to David wanting to get revenge. Oram also says,
David, I met the devil when I was a child.
Now what this means was answered in an interview that comes from the YouTube channel Bad Taste.
Oram came from a sort of Pentecostal background. If you didn't behave properly, you were like physically assaulted. And so to his mind, I think the devil was his grandfather.
However, the way I always interpret it was there being some abuse there that went along the lines of stuff we'll get demonetized for mentioning on YouTube. But you know what I mean. And the Alien series has lots of themes of sexual assault, and the facehugger was of course designed to be a metaphor for that. The facehugger's what kills Oram, and he goes to the egg to stick his face in it. So this could be him facing his own devil again and bringing these moments full circle. If he had to deal with abuse as a child and then face it again when he's impregnated by a facehugger, you can see how there's definitely that sort of connection. So it's very deep if you go that far into it, but they don't really mention it in the movie. Crudup apparently also found it difficult to film, as he was constantly laughing throughout the scene. According to IMDb trivia, he was a big fan of Alien and quite excited to do that John Hurt scene.
Oh no, not again.
Sticking his face forward though, he said he kept laughing in anticipation. Scott even said only an idiot would stick his face over an egg. And yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth, mate. To be fair to Oram though, he doesn't know what's happening. It's the audience that does. And from his point of view, you know, that there's no reason to not trust androids.
Idle hands at the devil's workshop, Captain.
But yeah, like, the guy's he's just led you through a house of horrors, and now he's taking you to a room of creepy eggs. You're an idiot.
Perfectly safe. I assure you.
Moron. I do love how David wakes him up by throwing rocks at him though, and yeah, just a nice bit of dark humor. Kill all these morons, King. Again though, I feel like it all happens really fast, and we don't really get like the tension that you sometimes get. Now this births the first xenomorph, and look how cute he is, sticking his arms up like little baby Groot. David then plays the flute, including notes from the Prometheus score. Now it's here that David says he's not going to allow humanity to start again. He says we're a dying species, which is why we're having to spread out and colonize. He says we don't deserve it, and that going forward, they basically need something better. Now it's here that Walter reveals that it was Shelley who wrote the poem. Shoutouts to IMDb trivia for pointing out that Percy Shelley, who wrote that, was also the husband of Mary Shelley. She wrote the novel Frankenstein, or as it's also known, the modern Prometheus. In this, Frankenstein of course creates a humanoid creature that in the end grows to hate its creator. It breaks free from his control and can be seen as a metaphor for David. David also says,
perfect organism.
Which is a nod to when Ash said it in Alien.
Perfect organism.
David ends up stabbing Walter, and I love how when he gets shut down, he basically just crouches. We then get a shot of his neck, and it looks like something weird's happening. What this was supposed to denote though was that he has a healing factor. This is how he recovers, and it's also something that gives David away later. He's an older model that doesn't have this built in, and thus his wounds remain. Daniels then comes across David's scrolls, which have some drawings of Shaw. They're also clearly based on Geiger's work. Now while this is going on, Lope gets a big nice face hug.
How are you saying it like that?
Even though it's cut up quickly though, it still implants the embryo. Because of this, there's been the thinking that if it makes contact, then that means you're screwed. However, there's also the thinking that when David heals up Lope's cheek later on, that he implants the egg there. Personally, I think it was done with a face hugger, but I have seen that conclusion. An important thing to note though, is that the xenomorph only kills Cole here. Alien 3 showcased that the creatures won't attack someone who's carrying an embryo. Because of this, it explains how he was able to escape and why it never attacked him when they were leaving the planet. During this time, David also attacks Daniels in the scroll room. From what I can gather, they wanted something similar to Alien when Ripley discovers the true mission. Ash then attacks with a rolled up magazine, and we have a droid attacking Daniels in here as well. They don't do the scroll, but yeah, that's what they were going for. Saved by Walter, we then see him and David going head to head. In what's one of the worst misdirects of all time, we don't see the outcome of the fight. However, it's pretty obvious David won. They did say they left a little clue to this though if you hadn't figured it out. As the lander leaves later on, his hood blows up on his jacket. This was supposed to be a little clue in case you're the one person who watches Screen Crush and didn't figure it out. I'm just kidding, Ryan. I love you. I'll do the fingering if you blow my flute.
Whoa, take it easy, sweetheart.
Nah, but seriously, all these Ryan jokes, people think I have genuine beef sometimes. And to be fair, I can see why.
Shut the f*** up, Ryan Airy.
Now, I really love the scene on the vessel where Daniel straps herself in and takes on the xenomorph. We watch as it crawls over the engines and Tennessee then burns it. This was done as a callback to the original where Ripley burns it with the engines on the shuttle. He also says,
"Walk in the park,"
which is what Parker said in the original.
Walk in the park.
Now, the creature in itself does look slightly similar to how it was portrayed there. Obviously though, that was a guy in a suit, so they couldn't make it as insect-like as they wanted. For this version though, they were able to make the hind legs longer. This is a design they used in Alien Isolation with the xenomorph standing a lot taller. They also looked at the body of a praying mantis and styled it more towards that. Daniels then manages to crush it in the crane, and yeah, great little action scene that was used in all of the trailers for a reason, because it's great. Now, as with all Alien movies, we then get a fourth act. However, there's a bit of calm before the storm, and we see David getting patched up. To pass himself off as David, he had to cut off his hand, and I feel like this kind of ties into the last movie. There he's talking about putting out a match with your fingers, and the trick was to not mind that it hurts.
The trick, William Potter, is not minding that it hurts.
Obviously, cutting off his hand hurt him, but he couldn't mind it due to what he wanted to do. I don't know if androids hurt, but yeah, that's always how I took it. Anyway, we journey across the ship and also catch a nodding bird. These have appeared throughout the series, with them first debuting in Alien. Unwilling to go into stasis, we then catch Daniels in bed. Like, you should have just slept like this for the rest of the trip, love. Anyway, there's an unidentified life form on board, and thus she's called to the med bay. While David watches on ominously, we see as the chest burst is now free. It's in this that we see the Xenomorph's vision, which has been a sore point with some fans. Technically, the creatures should be blind due to the skulls in their head not having eyes. However, Alien 3 showcased their vision, and it was throughout the games for Alien vs Predator. So this has been basically taken as them having nerve endings that can interpret light and sound, and then their brains read that as images. We then get Rickson up within a shower scene that feels ripped right out of a slasher. The Xenomorph's tail creeps up their legs, and it feels akin to Lambert's death in the original. Thus, they begin to seal some of the chambers on the ship to direct it. This sort of riffs off the vent scene that we had during Alien. In it, we also had a deleted scene where Ash would then let the creature out, which sort of gave away what his allegiances were. First time seeing this, I did wonder if Walter would do that, as Scott often does things in later films that he didn't get to do first time. This then leads to the loading bay, which is where a lot of Alien movies end. Airlocks, creatures blasted into space, you know, it's staples of the franchise. Daniels also says, "I got you, you son of a bitch!" which is a nod to this.
I got you.
Daniels also says they're gonna blow it into space, which yeah, exact same thing Ripley said. Either way, the bay doors open and all hell breaks loose. I love how the moisture in the air just freezes up and then floats around due to the lack of gravity. Still such a cool effect, and easily the best looking airlock scene. Unfortunately though, I feel some of the tension stripped away due to Daniels having support. In the past, Ripley's normally on her own, which makes her feel her most vulnerable. Here though, we know there's a lot of people supporting her, so yeah, I just don't think it works as much. Daniels then uses the loader to send it back to the planet, and yeah, everything seems grand. We then cut to David sitting back, and I love how you can read his reaction either way. You could see it as relief that they survived, or David being gutted the Xenomorph's dead. So yeah, at least they kind of play with it. But mate, I'm not getting into that pod until I've asked you to recite every conversation we've ever had. She brings up the cabin story and realizes he doesn't know what he's talking about, but too late, love. You're locked in now. You should really build these stasis pods with something on the inside that you can like use to open them. That seems like a design flaw. It's a very obvious feature. I love how you see her heartbeat increasing though as it dawns on her, but yeah, bit of an idiot, and I'm glad she's dead. David then walks out to Entry of the Gods into Valhalla, but this time he's got a full symphony. Whereas at the beginning he said the piano sounded bare, this now plays up he's got an orchestra to play with. It's such a great ending in which he coughs up a facehugger embryo, which Scott said he came up with after watching a Narcos documentary. He talked about how drug mules smuggle things through airports by swallowing condoms full of stuff that they then cough up on the other side. He's now brought this on board, and yeah, though the movie's a bit mid to me, great ending. It shows the artificiality that represents David. The facehugger's the opposite, and now we have a combination of both artificial and real, which basically sums up the covenant that David and the Xenomorphs have now made. We then hear his final log where he signs off in typical Alien fashion. However, he logs off as Walter and says the crew all perished in the solar flare, except for Daniels in Tennessee. However, this highlights he's covering it up and won't ever log them going to the planet. He now has all these souls at his mercy, and we know he'll go on to make the Xenomorphs. And I do hope we see him again. Obviously Scott's original plan isn't panning out, but we do know we're going to be getting a sequel to Romulus. I do hope we see him in that, as I think that would be such a good way to bridge the franchise. Maybe he's camped out on the Paradise planet, and maybe we'll see that Paradise is lost, eh? That's an idea for you guys, yeah? Write that one down. As for this one, I still feel pretty much exactly how I felt upon leaving the cinema for the first time. It has its moments, but yeah, it just feels like a dumb horror movie. I think if you told me that a new director had been handed the reins, I would have probably believed you. The fact that this is Ridley Scott though, yeah, it's just disappointing. Overall, I feel like this is a Rise of Skywalker situation where it's having to deal with the backlash from the prior film. Unfortunately though, there's a lot of stuff they still don't explain. We've now had 2 prequel movies at this point and still don't really know about the origins of the space jockey or xenomorphs. What was all the cave paintings about? How did they end up on LV-426, you know? 2 movies, and we still don't know. Though they kind of explain what David did though, I still have so many questions that I could probably rant away for half an hour on. I feel like we need another movie to explain all the questions in this one, but I don't know if we'll ever fully get the answers. So yeah, out of all of the mainline series, I actually feel like this is the worst one, which is a shame, as I think Ridley coming back, the Xenomorphs, David's return as well, it should have been a home run. But unfortunately, we go out on a dull note, for me at least, and that's our wrap up of the prequels. We will of course be back for Alien Earth, and if you're in the future and have seen it, then let us know how it went. Please drop a like on the video as well, and drop a comment with your thoughts below. Did you know that members of the channel also get early access to videos? If you click the join button, you get at least one breakdown a week before anyone else. It costs just 99 cents a month, and we've tried to set it where hopefully it's not a lot to you, but if a lot of you do it, then it will mean a lot to us, so we appreciate it. Now if you want something else to watch and you missed our Prometheus breakdown, then that's on screen right now. We also have our Ultimate Alien Quadrilogy breakdown on screen as well. That's a big one, that goes over all those 4 films with Ripley, and yeah, if you fancy some more Alien, then definitely head over there right after this. But out of the way, thank you for watching this one. I've been your host Paul, you've been the best, I'll see you next time. Take care, peace.